In 1873 Montana, a woman's society called Worthless stepped off a stagecoach with nothing but a worn carpet bag and her grandmother's iron skillet. The town laughed. The men sneered. They all said she'd be gone within a week. But what they didn't know was that this exhausted, heavy-set woman who couldn't even afford proper shoes would one day build an empire that would make the wealthiest land barons in the territory beg for mercy. This is her story, a story of survival, defiance, and the brutal fight to prove that dignity isn't given, it's earned through blood, sweat, and an iron will that refuses to break. If you want to see how one woman turned mockery into legend, stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of Black Hollow's general store, kicking up a cloud of dust that hung in the late September air like a dirty curtain. Evelyn Mercer was the last passenger to climb down, her legs shaking from 3 days of being cramped on wooden benches that seemed designed to punish the human spine. She stood there for a moment, one hand gripping her carpet bag, the other clutching the handle of her grandmother's cast-iron skillet wrapped in an old flour sack. The town looked exactly like she'd feared, rough, unwelcoming, and full of eyes that had already started judging her before her feet even touched the ground. A group of men loitering outside the saloon stopped their conversation mid-sentence. One of them, a lanky cowboy with a tobacco-stained beard, nudged his companion and said something Evelyn couldn't quite hear. But she heard the laughter that followed, sharp, cutting. The kind of laughter that tells you exactly what people think of you without them having to say a word. She kept her chin up and started walking toward the boarding house she'd been told about in the last town. Her boots, worn through at the soles and held together with hope and twine, scuffed against the dirt road. "Well, I'll be," another voice called out from somewhere behind her. "Looks like Black Hollow's getting itself another charity case." More laughter. Evelyn didn't turn around. She'd heard worse. Much worse. Back in Ohio, after her father died and the creditors took everything, she'd stood in the town square while the auctioneer sold off every piece of furniture her family had owned. The women she'd grown up with, women who used to invite her to quilting bees and church socials, had stood in clusters, whispering behind their gloved hands, their faces twisted with something between pity and satisfaction. That was when Evelyn learned an important lesson. People will always find a reason to look down on you if you let them, and she'd sworn she wouldn't let them, not anymore. The boarding house turned out to be a sagging two-story structure that looked like it was being held up by stubbornness alone. A hand-painted sign above the door read, "Mrs. Garrett's rooms, clean beds, fair prices." Evelyn pushed open the door and found herself in a dim hallway that smelled of boiled cabbage and old wood. An older woman with gray hair pulled into a severe bun appeared from a side room. She looked Evelyn up and down with the kind of calculating gaze that could price a person's worth down to the penny. "Help you?" Mrs. Garrett's tone suggested she doubted it. "I need a room," Evelyn said. "Just for a few nights while I find work." Mrs. Garrett's eyebrows went up. "Work? What kind of work you planning to find in Black Hollow?" "Cooking, cleaning, whatever needs doing." The older woman let out a short bark of laughter. "Honey, there's two types of women who find work in this town. Respectable married ladies who already got themselves a home, and the girls who work over at the Silver Spur, if you catch my meaning. I don't see a wedding ring on your finger, and I don't imagine you're looking to join the girls at the saloon." Evelyn's jaw tightened. "No, ma'am, but I can cook better than anyone you've ever met, and I'm not afraid of hard work." "That right?" Mrs. Garrett crossed her arms. "And where exactly do you think someone's going to hire a woman who just rolled into town with nothing but a carpet bag and a skillet?" "I'll find out tomorrow." Evelyn set down her bag. "How much for 3 nights?" $2. It was highway robbery, and they both knew it, but Evelyn pulled the coins from her pocket without argument. She couldn't afford to make enemies, not when she had exactly $7.30 to her name, and no prospects beyond a vague rumor she'd heard 2 towns back that Black Hollow ranches sometimes needed cooks. Mrs. Garrett pocketed the money and jerked her head toward the stairs. "Third door on the left. Breakfast is at 6 if you want it. Costs extra." The room was barely larger than a closet. A narrow bed with a lumpy mattress, a washstand with a cracked basin, and a single window that overlooked the alley behind the building. Evelyn set her bag on the bed and sank down beside it, suddenly so tired she could barely keep her eyes open. She unwrapped her grandmother's skillet and ran her fingers over the smooth, worn surface. Her grandmother had used this skillet for 40 years, cooking everything from Sunday roast to birthday cakes. When she died, she'd left it to Evelyn with a single piece of advice. A good woman makes a good home wherever she goes. Don't you forget that. Evelyn hadn't forgotten, but sometimes it felt like the whole world had conspired to make sure she never got the chance to prove it. She slept poorly that night, jerking awake every few hours to unfamiliar sounds. Shouting from the saloon down the street, a dog barking in the alley, the creak of floorboards as other residents moved through the building. When dawn finally broke, she dragged herself out of bed, washed her face in the basin, and put on her only other dress, a plain brown calico that had seen better days but was at least clean. Mrs. Garrett was already in the kitchen when Evelyn came downstairs, frying eggs in a pan that looked like it hadn't been properly cleaned in weeks. The eggs came out greasy and overcooked, served alongside bread so hard it could have been used as a weapon. "You mentioned you could cook," Mrs. Garrett said, watching Evelyn struggle to saw through the bread. "You really any good, or were you just talking big?" Evelyn looked up. "I'm good." "Prove it." For a moment, Evelyn didn't understand. Then Mrs. Garrett stepped away from the stove and gestured toward it. "You say you can cook better than anyone I've met. Show me." Evelyn stood slowly, her heart starting to pound. This wasn't how she'd planned to spend her first morning, but she wasn't about to turn down a challenge. She rolled up her sleeves and surveyed the kitchen. It was a mess. Dirty pans piled in the basin, ingredients scattered across the work table, a wood stove that looked like it hadn't been cleaned out properly in months. First things first. She cleaned the pan Mrs. Garrett had been using, then checked what ingredients were available. Not much to work with: eggs, flour, a bit of bacon fat, some withered potatoes, a handful of dried herbs that had probably been sitting in that jar since the previous winter. But Evelyn had made do with less. She diced the potatoes fine and fried them in the bacon fat until they started to crisp. While they cooked, she whisked eggs with a splash of water and a pinch of the dried herbs. When the potatoes were ready, she pushed them to the side of the pan and poured in the eggs, letting them set just enough before folding them over the potatoes. The smell alone was enough to make Mrs. Garrett lean in closer. When Evelyn slid the finished breakfast onto a plate, the older woman stared at it for a long moment. Then she picked up a fork and took a bite, and another, and another. She didn't say a word until the plate was empty. "Where'd you learn to cook like that?" "My grandmother." Evelyn started cleaning the pan. "She taught me everything she knew. Said cooking was the one thing nobody could ever take away from you." Mrs. Garrett was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You really looking for work?" "Yes, ma'am. There's a ranch about 6 miles outside town, Boone Ridge. Owner's a man named Silas Boone. Widower, runs one of the biggest cattle operations in the territory. Word is he's been trying to hire a cook for the better part of 3 months, but nobody wants the job." Evelyn turned around. "Why not?" "Because he's a hard man to work for. Lost his wife 5-6 years back and hasn't been quite right since. Expects perfection, doesn't tolerate mistakes, and fires people soon as they disappoint him. Plus the ranch is isolated. You'd be living out there with just him and about 20 ranch hands. Most women won't touch a job like that. Say it ain't proper." "How much does it pay?" $20 a month plus room and board. $20. It was more money than Evelyn had seen in months. Enough to maybe save something, maybe build a future instead of just surviving day to day. "How do I get there?" Mrs. Garrett studied her for a long moment. "You serious about this?" "Yes, ma'am. Supply wagon heads out that direction every Tuesday morning. Driver's name is Pete Lawson. You be at the general store at dawn. I'll make sure he knows to give you a ride." Evelyn's hands were shaking as she finished washing the pan. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. Silas Boone might take one look at you and send you right back to town." The older woman wasn't wrong, and Evelyn knew it, but she'd come too far to turn back now. Tuesday morning arrived cold and gray, with a wind that cut through Evelyn's thin shawl like it wasn't even there. She stood outside the general store with her carpet bag and her grandmother's skillet, waiting for the supply wagon. Around her, Black Hollow was slowly waking up. Shopkeepers sweeping their storefronts, a few early risers heading toward the cafe for breakfast, ranch hands preparing for another day's work. Pete Lawson turned out to be a grizzled man in his 50s with a face like old leather and eyes that had seen too much. He looked at Evelyn the way you might look at a piece of furniture someone was trying to give away for free, vaguely suspicious about why nobody else wanted it. "You the cook?" he asked. "I'm hoping to be." He grunted and jerked his thumb toward the back of the wagon. "Climb on up. Try not to break nothing." The ride to Boone Ridge Ranch took nearly 2 hours, following a rough dirt track that wound through scrubby hills dotted with sagebrush and scattered pine trees. Pete didn't say much, which suited Evelyn fine. She was too nervous to make small talk anyway. When the ranch finally came into view, Evelyn felt her stomach drop. It was massive, a sprawling operation that stretched across the valley floor. Corrals, barns, bunkhouses, storage sheds, and a main house that looked like it had been built to withstand a siege. Cattle dotted the surrounding hills like dark spots on a canvas. In the distance, she could see ranch hands working with horses, their shouts carrying on the wind. This was nothing like the small family farms she'd worked on back in Ohio. This was an empire. "Silas runs a tight operation," Pete said, breaking his silence. "You mess up out here, you won't get a second chance." "I don't plan on messing up." He gave her a skeptical look but didn't argue. The wagon rolled to a stop in front of the main house, and Pete climbed down to start unloading supplies. Evelyn gathered her things and stepped down carefully, trying not to trip over her own worn-out boots. "Wait here," Pete said. "I'll let him know you're here." He disappeared inside the house, leaving Evelyn standing alone in the ranch yard. A few of the ranch hands had noticed her arrival and were watching from a distance, their expressions ranging from curious to openly amused. "Hey, Pete," one of them called out. "That the new cook?" Another voice answered before Pete could respond. "Hell, that can't be right. Looks like someone's maiden aunt come to visit." Laughter rippled through the group. Evelyn kept her eyes fixed on the house, her face burning. "Just ignore them. You've heard worse." The door opened and Pete emerged, followed by a tall man with broad shoulders and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. Silas Boone. He had to be. Everything about him radiated authority. The way he moved, the way he looked at her with those cold, assessing eyes, the way silence fell over the ranch yard the moment he appeared. He stopped a few feet away and looked her up and down. The inspection lasted maybe 10 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. "You're the cook?" His voice was deep, rough around the edges. "Yes, sir. Evelyn Mercer." "How old are you?" 28. "You ever cook for more than a family before?" "No, sir, but I'm a fast learner." Something that might have been amusement flickered in his eyes. "Fast learner, right. You know what we do here, Miss Mercer?" "You run cattle." "We run cattle across 3,000 acres. I've got 22 men working this ranch year-round, and during roundup that number doubles. Those men work from sunup to sundown, and they expect 3 hot meals a day. They expect coffee strong enough to wake the dead. They expect biscuits that don't break their teeth, and meat that's actually edible. You think you can handle that?" Evelyn met his gaze without flinching. "I know I can." "You know." He crossed his arms. "And what exactly makes you so confident?" "Because I've spent the last 3 years cooking in boarding houses and railroad camps, feeding 50 men at a time with half the supplies and twice the complaints. Your ranch might be bigger, Mr. Boone, but the work isn't any different. Men get hungry, I feed them. It's that simple." It wasn't entirely true. The railroad camp job had only lasted 6 months before the foreman tried to get handsy and she'd left in the middle of the night. But Silas Boone didn't need to know that. He studied her for another long moment. Then he turned to Pete. "You can go." Pete nodded and climbed back onto his wagon without a word, leaving Evelyn alone with Silas. "I've had 4 cooks in the last 3 months," Silas said quietly. "First one lasted 2 weeks before she decided ranch life wasn't for her. Second one couldn't handle the isolation. Third one got into a fight with one of my men, and I had to let her go. Fourth one didn't even make it through the first day, took one look at the kitchen and walked straight back to town." He paused, his eyes hard. "I don't have time for people who quit. I don't have patience for people who can't do the job. And I sure as hell don't have sympathy for people who think they deserve special treatment just because things get difficult. You understand me?" "Yes, sir." "You'll work 6 days a week. Sundays you get off, but you're still expected to leave cold meals prepared. You'll get $20 a month paid on the first, room and board included. You'll have your own quarters behind the kitchen. You step out of line, you're gone. You can't do the job, you're gone. You cause problems with my men, you're gone. Clear?" "Crystal clear." "Good." He He started walking toward the house. Come on, I'll show you where you'll be working. Evelyn followed him across the yard, very aware of the ranch hands still watching. She heard one of them mutter something under his breath, followed by muffled laughter, but she kept her eyes forward and her mouth shut. The kitchen was bigger than she'd expected. A large room with a massive wood stove, long work tables, shelves stocked with supplies, and a door that led to what looked like a pantry. It was also an absolute disaster. Dirty pots and pans were piled in the basin. The floor hadn't been swept in what looked like days. The stove was caked with grease and burnt food. Silas must have seen the expression on her face because he said, "Last cook left in a hurry, didn't exactly clean up after herself." Evelyn set down her bag and her skillet. "When do the men expect dinner?" 6 o'clock. Why? She glanced at the window. Based on the angle of the sun, it was probably around 2 in the afternoon. Just wanted to know how much time I had. You planning to cook tonight? That's what you hired me for, isn't it? For the first time, something that might have been approval crossed his face. Your quarters are through that door. Get yourself settled, then come find me if you need anything. He left without another word, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. Evelyn stood alone in the filthy kitchen and took a deep breath. Then she rolled up her sleeves and got to work. Ye aunt. The next 4 hours were a blur of scrubbing, organizing, and cooking. Evelyn attacked the kitchen like it was a personal enemy, scraping grease off the stove, washing every pot and pan, sweeping the floor until the boards showed their natural color again. While she worked, she took inventory of the supplies. Good quality beef, beans, flour, potatoes, onions, dried fruit, coffee, lard, and enough spices to work with. By the time the dinner bell rang at 6, she had prepared a meal that would have made her grandmother proud. Roasted beef with onions and carrots, beans cooked with bacon fat and molasses, fresh biscuits, and strong coffee. The ranch hands filed into the dining hall attached to the kitchen, a long room with 2 tables and benches that could seat about 30 men. They came in loud and dirty, smelling of sweat and horses and the day's work. The conversation died the moment they saw Evelyn standing by the kitchen door. "Well, I'll be damned," one of them said. "She actually showed up." "Question is whether she can actually cook," another one muttered. Evelyn ignored them and started bringing out the food. She moved efficiently, setting platters on the tables, pouring coffee into tin cups, making sure everyone had what they needed. The men watched her with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism, but they didn't say anything directly to her, not until they started eating. The first few bites were met with silence. Then one of the older hands looked up and said, "This is actually good." "Better than good," another one added, reaching for a second biscuit. "Hell, this is the best meal we've had in months." A younger cowboy with red hair and freckles looked over at Evelyn. "You make this yourself?" "That's generally how cooking works," Evelyn said dryly. A few of the men laughed, and just like that, some of the tension in the room eased. Not all of it. She could still feel them watching her, still sense the judgment and doubt, but enough that she could breathe a little easier. Silas appeared in the doorway halfway through the meal. He didn't sit down with the men, just stood there watching. When his eyes met Evelyn's, he gave a small nod that might have been approval. Or maybe just acknowledgement. It was hard to tell with a man like him. After dinner, the ranch hands filed out, most of them looking surprised that they'd actually enjoyed the meal. A few even thanked her on their way out, though their tone suggested they hadn't expected to. Evelyn was elbow-deep in dishwater when Silas came back into the kitchen. "That was a good meal," he said. She glanced over her shoulder. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. Just do it again tomorrow." He left before she could respond. Evelyn finished the dishes, wiped down the work tables, and banked the fire in the stove. By the time she finally made it to her quarters, a small but clean room with a bed, a washstand, and a trunk for her belongings, she was so exhausted she could barely stand. But she'd made it through the first day, and that was something. The next morning, Evelyn woke at 4:30 to the sound of someone pounding on her door. "Breakfast is at 5:30, a voice yelled. "Don't be late." She dragged herself out of bed, splashed cold water on her face, and stumbled into the kitchen. The pre-dawn darkness outside was absolute, broken only by the light from her lantern. She got the stove going, started coffee, and began preparing breakfast. Fried potatoes, eggs, bacon, and more biscuits. The ranch hands showed up right on time, filing in with the grim determination of men who knew they had a long day ahead of them. They ate quickly and efficiently, barely speaking except to ask for more coffee. One of them, a lean, hard-faced man with a scar running down his left cheek, watched Evelyn with unconcealed hostility. She'd noticed him the night before too, but now his stare was more direct, more deliberate. "Something wrong?" she asked, meeting his eyes. "Just wondering how long you'll last," he said. "The pretty ones never make it past a week." The table went quiet. Evelyn set down the coffee pot. "I'm not pretty, and I'm not going anywhere, so you might as well get used to seeing me." The scarred man's expression darkened, but before he could respond, another ranch hand, an older man with gray at his temples, let out a rough laugh. "She's got you there, Cutter. You gonna eat, or you gonna stare at the cook all morning?" Cutter glared at both of them, then went back to his breakfast without another word. The older man caught Evelyn's eye and gave her a slight nod. She nodded back, grateful for the small show of support. The pattern repeated itself for days. Wake before dawn, prepare breakfast, clean up while the men worked, prepare lunch, clean up, prepare dinner, clean up again. The work was relentless, exhausting, and never-ending. Evelyn's hands developed blisters that turned into calluses. Her back ached constantly. She fell into bed every night too tired to even think. But she didn't quit. She learned the rhythms of the ranch, when the men came in from the fields, what they liked to eat, how much coffee they could consume in a single sitting. She learned their names, their quirks, their preferences. Some of them started warming up to her. Others remained distant, treating her like a temporary fixture that would disappear soon enough. Cutter continued to make his hostility known, though he was careful never to cross the line into outright insubordination. He'd make cutting remarks just loud enough for her to hear, or he'd accidentally knock over the salt shaker and then smirk while she cleaned it up. Evelyn ignored him. She had bigger problems to worry about, like the fact that she was starting to run out of supplies. On Friday of her second week, she approached Silas in his office, a cluttered room in the main house filled with ledgers, maps, and the general chaos of someone trying to run a massive operation. "Mr. Boone, I need to talk to you about supplies." He looked up from a stack of papers. "What about them?" "I'm running low on flour, sugar, and coffee. If you want me to keep feeding your men properly, I'll need more by the end of next week." Silas frowned. "I just got a shipment 3 weeks ago. How are you already running low?" "Because the last cook apparently didn't know how to manage inventory. Half the flour I found had weevils in it, and someone left the sugar barrel unsealed so it absorbed moisture and clumped together. I had to throw out at least 20 pounds of unusable supplies." He sat back in his chair, studying her. "And you didn't think to mention this before now?" "I wanted to make sure I was going to last more than a few days before I started making demands." The ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Fair enough. Make a list of what you need. I'll have Pete bring it out with the next supply run." "Thank you." She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. "Evelyn?" It was the first time he'd used her first name. She looked back. "You're doing good work," he said quietly. "The men have noticed." Something warm uncurled in her chest, but she kept her expression neutral. "Just doing my job, Mr. Boone." "Silas, if you're going to work here, you might as well call me Silas." "All right, Silas." He nodded and went back to his paperwork, but Evelyn left the office feeling like she'd just won a small but significant victory. The trouble started on a Tuesday morning during the third week. Evelyn woke before dawn as usual and headed to the kitchen to start breakfast. But the moment she walked through the door, she knew something was wrong. The flour barrel had been tipped over, spilling white powder across the floor. The eggs she'd carefully stored in a crate had been smashed, leaving a sticky mess on the work table. And the coffee, her precious coffee that she'd been rationing so carefully, had been dumped into the slop bucket. For a moment, she just stood there, staring at the destruction. Then fury rose up in her chest, hot and sharp and all-consuming. This wasn't an accident. This was sabotage. Someone had deliberately destroyed her supplies, knowing it would make it impossible for her to prepare breakfast. She thought about Cutter's hostile stares, his cutting remarks, the way he watched her like he was waiting for her to fail. Of course it was him. Who else would it be? For one wild moment, she considered marching straight to Silas's office and demanding that Cutter be fired. But she stopped herself. She had no proof. And even if she did, running to the boss the first time something went wrong would make her look weak, helpless, like she couldn't handle the job, like she needed to be rescued. No, she'd handle this herself. Evelyn looked around the ruined kitchen, her mind racing. The men would be expecting breakfast in less than an hour. She had no flour for biscuits, no eggs, and no coffee. But she still had potatoes, bacon, and the beef she'd been planning to use for dinner. She grabbed her grandmother's skillet from where it hung on the wall and headed outside. The sky was just starting to lighten, the air cold and crisp. Evelyn built a fire in the stone ring the ranch hands used for branding, setting up a makeshift outdoor kitchen. She sliced potatoes and onions, fried bacon until it was crispy, and cooked the beef in the rendered fat. By the time the ranch hands started gathering for breakfast, Evelyn had prepared a meal over an open fire in the freezing pre-dawn darkness. They stood there staring at her, their expressions ranging from confusion to something that might have been respect. "Kitchen had some trouble this morning," Evelyn said, her voice steady. "So we're eating out here." She served the food without explanation, without complaint, without giving anyone the satisfaction of seeing her rattled. The men ate in silence, but she could feel the shift in the atmosphere. They'd expected her to quit, to cry, to run to Silas for help. Instead, she dragged a skillet outside and cooked their breakfast over a campfire like it was the most natural thing in the world. When Cutter reached for his plate, Evelyn met his eyes. The hostility was still there, but now it was mixed with something else. Uncertainty, maybe, or the dawning realization that she wasn't going to break as easily as he'd thought. After breakfast, she cleaned up the outdoor cooking area, then went back inside to survey the damage in the kitchen. It took her 2 hours to clean up the mess, salvage what supplies she could, and get everything back in working order. She was scrubbing the last of the flour off the floor when Silas appeared in the doorway. "Heard you had some trouble this morning." Evelyn didn't look up. "Nothing I couldn't handle?" "That's not what I asked." She sat back on her heels, pushing a strand of hair out of her face. "Someone dumped my flour, smashed my eggs, and ruined my coffee. I don't know who, and I don't have proof, but I made breakfast anyway, so it doesn't really matter." Silas's expression darkened. "It matters to me. You work for me, and nobody sabotages my operation. You got a suspicion about who did this?" "Like I said, I don't have proof." "That's not what I asked." Evelyn met his eyes. "With all due respect, Silas, if I can't prove it, then pointing fingers just makes me look like I'm making excuses. I'd rather let my work speak for itself." He studied her for a long moment. Then he said, "You're tougher than I gave you credit for." "Is that a compliment?" "It's an observation." He paused. "But yeah, I suppose it is." After he left, Evelyn went back to scrubbing the floor. Her hands were raw, her back ached, and she was running on maybe 4 hours of sleep. But she'd survived another test, and she was still here. That counted for something. The weeks turned into a month, and then 2. Evelyn settled into the rhythm of ranch life, learning to anticipate problems before they happened, to stretch supplies when shipments were delayed, to read the moods of the men and adjust accordingly. Some of the ranch hands became downright friendly. The older man who defended her that first morning, his name was Frank, started helping her carry heavy pots and would occasionally stay after meals to keep her company while she washed dishes. A young cowboy named Tommy, barely 18 and homesick for his mother's cooking, began volunteering to help with food prep in exchange for extra biscuits. Even Cutter's hostility seemed to ease slightly, though he still watched her with suspicion. And Silas was harder to read. He didn't eat with the men, preferring to take his meals alone in his office. But he'd started showing up in the kitchen more often, ostensibly to discuss supplies or schedules, but staying longer than necessary. Sometimes he'd lean against the work table and just watch her cook, not saying much, just present. Evelyn tried not to read too much into it. He was the boss, she was the cook. There were clear lines, and crossing them would be dangerous for both of them. But she couldn't deny the way her heart beat a little faster when he walked into the room, or the way his rare smiles made something warm bloom in her chest. One evening in late November, after the men had finished dinner and cleared out, Silas appeared in the kitchen carrying a wooden crate. "What's that?" Evelyn asked, wiping her hands on her apron. "Early Christmas present." He set the crate on the work table. "Figured you could use some new supplies." She opened it and found jars of honey, real vanilla extract, dried fruit, cinnamon, nutmeg, and a bag of white sugar. The expensive kind, not the rough brown stuff she usually worked with. Silas, this must have cost a fortune. Consider it an investment. Happy cook means happy ranch hands. Happy ranch hands means less complaining and more work getting done. She looked up at him. Is that the only reason? The question hung in the air between them. For a moment, she thought he might actually answer honestly, but then he stepped back, his expression closing off. Get some rest, Evelyn. Winter's coming, and it's going to be a hard one. He left before she could say anything else. Evelyn stood alone in the kitchen, her fingers brushing over the jars of expensive spices, and allowed herself a small smile. Maybe she was reading into things. Maybe she was being foolish. But for the first time since arriving at Boone Ridge Ranch, she felt like she might actually belong here. And that was more than she dared to hope for in a very long time. Winter hit Montana territory like a fist to the jaw, sudden, brutal, and unforgiving. The first major storm arrived in early December, dumping 2 feet of snow overnight and trapping the ranch in a white silence that felt almost suffocating. Evelyn woke to find frost coating the inside of her window and her breath visible in the air even inside her small quarters. She dressed quickly, layering every piece of clothing she owned, and headed to the kitchen. The wood stove had gone out during the night. She spent 20 minutes coaxing it back to life, her fingers so numb she could barely feel the matches. By the time the fire was roaring and the kitchen started to warm up, her hands had developed that painful tingling that comes when frozen flesh begins to thaw. The ranch hands stumbled in for breakfast, looking half-frozen themselves, their faces red from the wind, ice clinging to their beards and eyebrows. They ate without speaking, shoveling food into their mouths with the desperate efficiency of men who knew they had to go back out into that frozen hell as soon as the meal was done. "How bad is it out there?" Evelyn asked Frank as she refilled his coffee. "Bad enough. Lost part of the fence on the north pasture. Silas has got half the crew trying to round up the cattle before they wander too far. The other half is working on clearing paths between the buildings so we don't get completely snowed in. Anyone hurt? Not yet, but the day's young." He wasn't wrong. By noon, Tommy came limping into the kitchen with his ankle wrapped in makeshift bandages. He'd slipped on the ice and twisted it badly enough that he couldn't put weight on it. "Silas told me to stay inside," he said, looking miserable. "Said I'd just slow everyone down." Evelyn pulled out a chair. "Sit. Let me look at it." She unwrapped the bandages and examined the swelling. It wasn't broken, but it was badly sprained. She rewrapped it properly, using strips torn from an old sheet, and made him prop his foot up on a second chair. "You're stuck with me for a while," she told him. "Might as well make yourself useful. You can peel potatoes." Tommy's face brightened immediately. Being injured was bad enough, but being useless would have been unbearable for a young man trying to prove himself. He spent the rest of the afternoon sitting at the work table, peeling potatoes and talking about his family back in Kansas. His mother, who made the best apple pie he'd ever tasted. His father, who'd worked himself into an early grave trying to keep the farm running. His younger sister, who wrote him letters every month asking when he was coming home. "You ever think about going back?" Evelyn asked as she chopped onions for the evening stew. "Sometimes. But there's nothing there for me anymore. Ma remarried last year. Nice fellow, treats her well. He's got his own sons to help with the farm. Me being there would just mean another mouth to feed." He paused, his hand stilling on the potato peeler. "Out here, at least I'm earning my own way. That means something." Evelyn understood that better than he probably realized. The need to prove your worth, to feel like you mattered, to know that you weren't just dead weight being tolerated out of pity or obligation. She'd been chasing that feeling her entire adult life. The storm lasted 3 days. 3 days of relentless snow and wind that howled through every crack in the buildings, of men coming in half frozen and going back out again because the cattle wouldn't feed themselves, of Evelyn cooking massive quantities of hot food and strong coffee because it was the only thing keeping everyone from giving up entirely. On the 4th day, the sun finally broke through the clouds. The entire ranch looked like it had been buried under a blanket of white that sparkled so bright it hurt to look at directly. Silas called an emergency meeting in the dining hall after breakfast. The ranch hands gathered, looking exhausted and grim. "We lost 43 head of cattle," Silas said without preamble. "Some wandered off during the storm and froze to death before we could find them. Others got caught in a drift and suffocated. The fence damage is extensive. It's going to take at least 2 weeks to repair everything, assuming we don't get another storm. And we're burning through feed faster than I'd planned. If winter keeps hitting us this hard, we might not have enough to last until spring. The room was silent. 43 head of cattle represented thousands of dollars in lost revenue. For a ranch the size of Boone Ridge, it was survivable, but it was a serious blow nonetheless. "What do you need us to do?" Frank asked. "Everything. We need to shore up the remaining fences, build better windbreaks for the livestock, ration the feed more carefully, and pray we don't get another storm like that anytime soon." Silas's gaze swept across the room. "This is going to be a hard winter. Harder than most. Anyone who wants to leave, now's the time to say so." Nobody moved. "All right then, let's get to work." The meeting broke up, the men filing out in small groups, their conversations low and serious. Evelyn started clearing the tables, but Silas stopped her. "Got a minute?" "Of course." He waited until the room was empty, then pulled out a piece of paper covered in his rough handwriting. "I need you to cut back on portions, not drastically. I don't want the men going hungry, but enough to stretch our food supplies. If we have another storm or two like the last one, we might be looking at shortages by February." Evelyn studied the list. It was carefully calculated, showing exactly how much they had versus how much they needed. The math was tight. Very tight. "I can make this work," she said slowly, "but the men aren't going to be happy about smaller portions. They'll be a lot less happy if we run out of food entirely." "Fair point." She folded the paper and tucked it into her apron pocket. "I'll start today." Silas hesitated, then said, "You holding up all right?" The question caught her off guard. "I'm fine." "You've been working yourself half to death. I see the light in the kitchen at 4 in the morning. I see it still burning at midnight. That's the job. The job is cooking 3 meals a day, not running yourself into the ground." Evelyn set down the plates she'd been carrying. "With all due respect, Silas, you've been out in that storm for 3 days straight. You look like you haven't slept in a week, so maybe don't lecture me about working too hard." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Touché." "Besides," she added, her voice softening slightly, "keeping busy helps. Gives me less time to worry about whether the roof's going to blow off, or the stove's going to go out, or whether I'm going to wake up frozen solid one morning." "You're scared." It wasn't a question, and Evelyn saw no point in denying it. "Aren't you?" "Terrified." He said it so matter-of-factly that it took her a moment to process. "Every winter I'm scared I'm going to lose everything. The ranch, the cattle, the men who depend on me. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, and I can't breathe because I'm thinking about all the ways this could fall apart. But you keep going anyway. What else am I going to do? This is all I've got." He paused, his eyes meeting hers. "But it helps, having someone else who understands what's at stake. Someone who doesn't quit when things get hard. So thank you for staying." Before Evelyn could respond, he turned and walked out, leaving her standing alone in the dining hall with her heart pounding and a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the wood stove. The winter only got worse. 2 weeks after the first storm, another one hit. Then another. And another. By mid-January, the snow was piled so high around the buildings that they'd had to dig tunnels just to get from the bunkhouse to the barn. The cattle were gaunt and restless, huddling together for warmth. The men moved through their days with the grim determination of soldiers in a losing war. And Evelyn worked miracles in the kitchen. She stretched every ingredient as far as it would go, turning scraps into soup, bones into broth, and dried beans into meals that somehow still tasted good despite the limited supplies. She baked bread every other day instead of daily. She rationed the coffee so carefully that the men started treating each cup like liquid gold. She pickled, preserved, and stored every bit of food that came through her kitchen, wasting nothing. The men noticed. How could they not? They'd started with full plates and generous portions, and now they were eating carefully measured servings that left them satisfied but not quite full. But nobody complained. They understood what was happening, understood that Evelyn was the only thing standing between them and real hunger. One evening in late January, Cutter approached her after dinner. He stood awkwardly by the kitchen door, his hat in his hands, looking like a man about to pull his own teeth without whiskey. "Need something?" Evelyn asked, not unkindly. "Just wanted to say what you're doing here, making the food last. It's good work." She studied him carefully. This was the same man who'd sabotaged her kitchen on her 3rd week, the same man who'd watched her with undisguised hostility for months. "Thank you." He shifted his weight from one foot to the other. I was wrong about you. When you first showed up, I thought you were just another soft city woman who'd quit the first time things got hard. But you're tougher than most men I know. I'm not from the city, Evelyn said quietly. I'm from a farm in Ohio. My father broke his back trying to work land that never should have been farmed in the first place. When he died, we lost everything. I've been working since I was 14 years old, doing whatever I had to do to survive. So no, I'm not soft. And I don't quit. Cutter nodded slowly. I can see that now. He put his hat back on. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say. After he left, Frank appeared in the doorway with a knowing smile. Well now, hell must have frozen over. Why's that? Because I've known Cutter for 5 years, and I've never once heard him admit he was wrong about anything. You must have really impressed him. Evelyn went back to washing dishes. I just did my job. No, ma'am. You did a hell of a lot more than that. Frank leaned against the doorframe. You kept this ranch from falling apart. Silas knows it too, even if he's too stubborn to say so out loud. Silas has enough to worry about without worrying about me. That's where you're wrong. Man worries about you plenty. Why do you think he checks the kitchen every night before he goes to bed? Why do you think he makes sure there's always enough firewood stacked outside your door? You think that's just coincidence? Evelyn's hands stilled in the dishwater. Frank, I'm just saying what everyone else is too polite to mention. Boss has been alone a long time, longer than is healthy for any man. And then you showed up, and suddenly he's got something to care about besides cattle and fences and whether the winter's going to kill us all. He pushed away from the doorframe. Just think about it. He left before she could argue. Evelyn finished the dishes in silence, her mind churning. She'd noticed Silas's attention, of course, the way he found excuses to be in the kitchen, the way he watched her when he thought she wasn't looking, the way his voice softened slightly when he said her name. But she'd been so careful not to hope for too much. Hope was dangerous. Hope got you hurt. Still, she couldn't deny the way her pulse jumped every time he walked into the room, or the way she'd started paying more attention to her appearance, pinning her hair more carefully, wearing the dress that was slightly less worn than her everyday work clothes. She was falling for him. Maybe had already fallen, and that terrified her more than any winter storm ever could. The crisis came in early February. Evelyn was preparing breakfast when Silas burst into the kitchen, his face grim. We've got a problem. Big problem. What happened? A pack of wolves got into the south pasture last night, killed 6 cattle and scattered the rest. We're still trying to round them up, but some of them ran toward the ridge. If they get too far up the mountain, we might not find them before they freeze. Evelyn set down her knife. What do you need me to do? Keep the men fed. Some of them are going to be out all day tracking those cattle. Pack food they can take with them, something that won't freeze solid and can be eaten in the saddle. She was already moving, her mind racing through options. Give me 20 minutes. Evelyn worked with the focused intensity of someone who knew lives might depend on what she produced. She made sandwiches with the last of the bacon and wrapped them in oilcloth. She filled canteens with coffee so strong it could wake the dead. She packed dried fruit and hardtack into saddlebags, adding small parcels of jerky and cheese that the men could eat without stopping. By the time the search party assembled in the yard, she had enough provisions ready to keep them going for a full day. Silas took the supplies with a look that said more than words ever could. Thank you. Bring everyone back safe. That's the plan. He swung up into his saddle and led the group out, horses plunging through snow that came up past their knees. Evelyn watched from the kitchen window until they disappeared into the white landscape, her stomach tight with worry. The men who stayed behind were mostly the injured and the older hands who couldn't handle the brutal conditions on the mountain. Tommy's ankle had healed enough that he'd wanted to go, but Silas had ordered him to stay and help Evelyn with anything she needed. The day dragged by with agonizing slowness. Evelyn prepared lunch and dinner as usual, but her mind was up on that mountain with the search party. Every hour that passed without them returning made her more anxious. By nightfall, she was pacing the kitchen, unable to sit still. Tommy tried to distract her with conversation, but eventually gave up. They'll be fine, he said, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. Silas knows this land better than anyone. That doesn't mean something can't go wrong. No, ma'am, but worrying yourself sick won't help anyone. He was right, but that didn't make it any easier. The search party finally returned just after 8 o'clock. Evelyn heard the commotion in the yard and rushed outside without even grabbing her shawl. the cold hitting her like a physical blow. The men looked half dead, slumped in their saddles, their faces gray with exhaustion. But they were all there, all of them. And behind them, a small group of cattle plodded wearily through the snow. Silas dismounted slowly, moving like every muscle in his body ached. When he saw Evelyn standing in the doorway, something in his expression shifted, relief, maybe, or gratitude, or something deeper she couldn't quite name. "We found them," he said. "Most of them, anyway. Lost a few to the cold, but we got the majority back. Come inside, all of you. I've got hot food waiting." The men didn't need to be told twice. They filed into the dining hall, tracking snow and mud across the floor that Evelyn had scrubbed that morning. She didn't care. She just kept bringing out food, stew that had been simmering all day, fresh bread, coffee, anything she could think of to warm them up and fill their bellies. Silas was the last one to come in. He stood in the doorway, watching her move around the room with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You should eat," Evelyn said quietly. "In a minute." He stepped closer, lowering his voice so the other men wouldn't hear. "I spent the whole day thinking about whether we'd make it back. And every time I started to doubt, I kept thinking about you waiting here, about coming back to this kitchen, to you." Evelyn's breath caught. "Silas, I know I shouldn't say it. I know it's not appropriate, me being your employer and all, but I don't care anymore. Life's too short and too hard to pretend I don't feel what I feel." "And what exactly do you feel?" He looked at her like she was the only solid thing in a world that kept shifting under his feet. "That you're the best thing that's happened to this ranch. To me. That I don't want to imagine running this place without you. That somewhere along the way, you stopped being just the cook and became more." Before Evelyn could respond, Frank's voice called out from across the room. "Boss, you gonna eat, or you gonna stand there all night?" The moment shattered. Silas stepped back, his jaw tightening. "We'll talk later." He joined the men at the table, and Evelyn went back to serving food with shaking hands and a heart that was racing so fast she felt dizzy. Later that night, after everyone else had gone to bed, Evelyn was banking the fire in the kitchen stove when she heard footsteps behind her. "You're still up," Silas said. "So are you." He moved closer, and in the dim light from the dying fire, his face looked younger somehow, less guarded. "About what I said earlier." "Don't take it back," Evelyn interrupted. "Please don't take it back." "I wasn't going to." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to. When she didn't, his hand cupped her cheek, rough and warm. "I meant every word. This is a bad idea. You know that, right? Me working for you, living here, people already talk. Let them talk. I stopped caring what people thought a long time ago." "I haven't," Evelyn admitted. "I've spent my whole life trying to prove I'm not what people assume, that I'm not a charity case or a pity hire or someone who needs rescuing. If they think you're keeping me around because of feelings instead of my work, then they're idiots who don't know what they're talking about." His thumb brushed across her cheekbone. "You earned your place here long before I fell in love with you, Evelyn. Every person on this ranch knows that, and if anyone suggests otherwise, they'll answer to me." The words hung in the air between them. "In love with you." He'd said it so casually, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "Say something," he said quietly. Evelyn reached up and covered his hand with hers. "I'm scared." "Of me? Of this? Of caring about someone and losing them? Of finally having something good and watching it fall apart? I can't promise nothing bad will ever happen. Life out here is too hard for promises like that. But I can promise I'll fight for this. For us. For whatever this becomes." He paused. "If you want it to become something." Evelyn thought about all the years she'd spent alone, all the times she'd told herself that hoping for more was foolish, that safety meant keeping everyone at arm's length. And then she thought about what Silas had said, that life was too short and too hard to pretend. She stood on her toes and kissed him. It was brief, chaste, almost tentative, but it was answer enough. When she pulled back, Silas was smiling, really smiling. It transformed his whole face, made him look like a completely different person. "So what happens now?" Evelyn asked. "Now we figure it out as we go, together." "Together," she repeated, testing the word. It felt right. I liked the sound of that. They stood there for a long moment, just looking at each other, the kitchen warm and quiet around them. Outside, the wind was picking up again, promising another storm. But inside, Evelyn felt safer than she had in years. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. The news spread through the ranch within days, though neither Evelyn nor Silas made any official announcement. The men just knew. Maybe it was the way Silas started smiling more. Maybe it was the way Evelyn's whole demeanor softened slightly. Maybe it was just that in a place as isolated as Boone Ridge, nothing stayed secret for long. Most of the ranch hands seemed genuinely happy for them. Frank grinned like he'd won a bet. Tommy started whistling while he worked. Even Cutter offered a gruff, "about damn time," before going back to his usual silence. But the real test came when the supply wagon arrived from town 2 weeks later. Pete Lawson took one look at Evelyn and Silas standing together in the yard and let out a low whistle. "Well now, heard some interesting rumors in town. Is that right?" Silas's voice was carefully neutral. "Folks saying you've got yourself a woman out here. Some are saying it's inappropriate. A man and a woman living on the same property without being married. Others are saying worse things than that." Evelyn felt her stomach drop, but before she could say anything, Silas stepped forward. "What others are saying is none of my concern. This is my ranch, and I'll run it however I see fit. Evelyn works harder than anyone I've ever employed, and what happens between us is our business. Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me directly." Pete held up his hands. "Easy now. I'm not the one saying it. Just thought you should know what you're up against." "We can handle it," Evelyn said, finding her voice. "Thank you for the warning." After Pete left, Silas turned to her. "This is going to get ugly. The town gossips won't let this go." "I know. If you want to back away from this, now's the time. I'd understand." Evelyn looked at him, this hard, stubborn man who'd somehow become the most important person in her world, and made her decision. "I'm not going anywhere. Even if people talk, let them talk. I've survived worse than gossip." 3 days later, Silas announced at breakfast that he needed to make a trip into town to meet with the bank about extending credit for spring supplies. It was routine business, something he did every year around this time. But this year, something was different. "Evelyn's coming with me," he said, his tone making it clear this wasn't up for discussion. "She needs to pick up some supplies I can't get from Pete's wagon, and I want her to meet some of the people I do business with." The implication was clear. He was bringing her into town as his partner, not as his cook. He was making a statement. The trip to Black Hollow took most of the morning. They rode in the wagon in companionable silence, bundled in blankets against the cold, watching the landscape roll by. When they finally reached town, Evelyn's nerves kicked in full force. This was where it had all started, where she'd stepped off the stagecoach 6 months ago, terrified and alone, facing a town that had immediately judged her and found her wanting. Now she was coming back as Silas Boone's woman, and that changed everything. They stopped first at the bank. Silas conducted his business with the usual efficiency while Evelyn waited, very aware of the stares from the other customers. She kept her back straight and her expression calm, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her discomfort. When they left the bank, Silas took her arm. "There's someone I want you to meet." He led her to a small dressmaker's shop on the main street. A woman in her 40s looked up as they entered, her expression warming when she recognized Silas. "Mr. Boone, what brings you to town?" "Business, and I wanted to introduce you to Evelyn Mercer. Evelyn, this is Margaret Chen, best seamstress in the territory." Margaret's eyes went to Evelyn, and unlike most of the people they'd passed on the street, her gaze was curious rather than judgmental. "A pleasure. Are you looking for a new dress?" Evelyn glanced down at her worn calico. I hadn't really thought about it." "She needs several dresses," Silas said firmly. "Good quality fabric, practical designs, something that will hold up to ranch work but still look nice." "Silas, I can't afford—" "Consider it a bonus. You've been wearing the same 2 dresses for 6 months. It's time you had something new." Margaret was already pulling out fabric samples, chattering about cuts and colors, and what would work best for Evelyn's figure. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Evelyn let herself enjoy being fussed over. When they finally left the shop, with orders placed for 3 new dresses and a warm winter coat, Evelyn felt like she was walking on air. "You didn't have to do that," she said as they headed back to the wagon. "I wanted to. You deserve nice things, Evelyn. You deserve to be treated like you matter." Before she could respond, a sharp voice cut through the afternoon air. Well, if it isn't Silas Boone and his latest acquisition. They both turned to find three women standing on the boardwalk, all dressed in expensive fabrics with elaborate hats and expressions that dripped disdain. Evelyn recognized the type immediately, wealthy wives with nothing better to do than judge everyone around them. The one who'd spoken, a thin woman with a pinched face, continued, "Tell me, Silas, is she actually working at your ranch? Or is that just a polite fiction to explain why you've got an unmarried woman living under your roof?" The street had gone quiet. People were stopping to watch, waiting to see what would happen. Silas's expression turned to ice. "Evelyn is the finest cook I've ever employed. She's also the hardest worker on my ranch, which is more than I can say for most people in this town. And what happens on my property is none of your concern, Mrs. Whitmore." "Really?" Mrs. Whitmore's smile was vicious. "Because it seems to me that a man of your position should be more concerned about propriety, especially if he ever hopes to be taken seriously by the better families in this territory." Evelyn felt Silas tense beside her, and she knew he was about to say something that would burn every bridge he had with Black Hollow's social elite. Before he could, she stepped forward. "You're absolutely right, Mrs. Whitmore. Propriety is important, which is why I'm sure you'd never dream of standing on a public street gossiping about people you don't know and spreading rumors about situations you don't understand. That would be terribly improper." Mrs. Whitmore's face flushed red. "How dare you?" "Evelyn's right," Silas interrupted, his voice carrying across the street. "And while we're on the subject of propriety, maybe you should worry less about my ranch and more about the fact that your husband was seen coming out of the Silver Spur Saloon at 3 a.m. last Tuesday. I'm sure that's very proper." The color drained from Mrs. Whitmore's face. Her companions looked suddenly fascinated by their shoes. Silas took Evelyn's arm. "We're done here. Good day, ladies." They walked away with their heads high, leaving a stunned silence behind them. When they reached the wagon and climbed up, Evelyn started laughing, slightly hysterical laughter that she couldn't quite control. "Did you see her face?" she gasped between giggles. "I thought she was going to explode." Silas was grinning. "That was incredible. The way you just threw her words right back at her. I've been dealing with women like her my whole life. They're all the same. They think being cruel makes them important." Her laughter faded. "But, Silas, you just made some serious enemies." "They were never friends to begin with." He picked up the reins. "Besides, I meant what I said. I don't give a damn what anyone in this town thinks of me. The only opinion that matters is yours." As they headed back toward the ranch, Evelyn realized something had fundamentally shifted. Silas hadn't just defended her. He'd claimed her publicly, in front of the whole town, knowing exactly what it would cost him socially. And he'd done it anyway. Whatever happened next, they were in it together, for better or worse. The confrontation with Mrs. Whitmore turned out to be just the beginning. Within a week, the gossip had spread through Black Hollow like wildfire, twisting and growing uglier with each retelling. According to the rumors making their way back to the ranch, Evelyn was either a scheming opportunist who'd seduced her way into Silas's bed, or a desperate woman so pathetic that even a hardened widower had taken pity on her. Neither version bore any resemblance to the truth, but truth had never mattered much to people determined to think the worst. What worried Evelyn more than the gossip itself was the way it started affecting ranch business. Two suppliers who'd worked with Silas for years suddenly raised their prices without explanation. A contract to sell cattle to a buyer in Helena fell through at the last minute, the man citing concerns about doing business with someone of questionable character. And when Silas tried to secure a loan extension at the bank, routine business he'd done a dozen times before, the manager hemmed and hawed about reevaluating risk before finally approving it with significantly less favorable terms. Silas came back from that particular trip to town in a black mood that lasted for days. Evelyn heard him in his office late at night, going over the books again and again, and she knew he was trying to figure out how to keep the ranch afloat with less credit and higher costs. She wanted to help, but didn't know how. She was already stretching every penny in the kitchen budget. She'd already taken on extra work to free up the ranch hands for other tasks. What more could she do? The answer came from an unexpected source. It was early March, and the winter was finally starting to loosen its grip. The snow was melting in patches, revealing mud and dead grass underneath. The cattle were still gaunt from the hard months, but they'd survived. Most of them, anyway. Evelyn was in the kitchen preparing lunch when Frank appeared in the doorway with a stranger, a middle-aged man in a good suit who looked completely out of place on a working ranch. "Miss Mercer, this is Henry Abbott, runs the Copper Mountain mining camp about 30 miles north of here. Mr. Abbott, this is Evelyn Mercer, best cook in Montana Territory." Abbott removed his hat. "Pleasure to meet you, Miss Mercer. Frank here has been telling me about your cooking, and I have a business proposition for you." Evelyn wiped her hands on her apron. "What kind of proposition?" "I run a mining operation with about 100 workers. Good men, but they're a long way from civilization. And the food situation is, well, let's just say it's terrible. We've got a cook, but he can barely manage beans and hardtack. The men are complaining, morale is low, and I'm starting to worry about losing workers to other camps that treat them better." He pulled out a folded paper from his jacket. "Frank mentioned you might be willing to prepare meals for us. Not daily. I understand you've got your hands full here. But maybe twice a week? Hearty meals that can be transported and reheated. Stews, roasts, bread, that sort of thing. I'd pay top dollar, and I'd arrange for my own men to handle pickup and delivery so it wouldn't add to your workload." Evelyn glanced at Frank, who was watching her with an encouraging expression. "How much are we talking about?" $50 a week. Every week, as long as the arrangement works for both of us." $50 a week? That was more than double what Silas paid her in a month. The number made her head spin. "I'd need to talk to Mr. Boone," she said carefully. "This is his ranch, and I work for him. I can't make a decision like this without his approval." "Of course. Frank said as much, but I hope you'll consider it seriously. My men are desperate for decent food, and from what I've heard, you're exactly what we need." After Abbott left, promising to return in a few days for an answer, Evelyn stood in the kitchen trying to process what had just happened. Frank leaned against the doorframe, grinning. "You told him about my cooking?" she asked. "Ran into him in town last month. He was complaining about his camp cook, and I mentioned we had the best cook in the territory. Didn't think much of it until he showed up today asking to meet you. $50 a week is a lot of money." "It is, and you'd be earning every penny. Cooking for 100 miners twice a week on top of everything you already do here? That's not going to be easy." "Nothing about this life is easy." Evelyn started pulling out ingredients for lunch, her mind already racing ahead. "But if I could pull it off, you'd be making more money than most of the ranch hands. Hell, more than me, and I've been working ranches for 20 years. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. Evelyn had spent her entire adult life scraping by, always one disaster away from destitution. The idea of actually making good money, of maybe saving something for the future, felt almost impossible to believe. But first she had to talk to Silas. She found him in the barn that evening, checking on a mare who was due to foal any day. He looked tired, his shoulders tight with tension, and Evelyn hesitated before interrupting. "Got a minute?" she asked. He looked up, and his expression softened slightly when he saw her. "For you, always." She explained Abbott's offer, watching Silas's face carefully as she laid out the details. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, his hand absently stroking the mare's neck. $50 a week, he said finally. "I know it sounds like a lot." "It is a lot. It's also exactly what your cooking is worth." He turned to face her fully. "But are you sure you can handle it? You're already working yourself to the bone here, adding 100 miners on top of that." "I can handle it," Evelyn said, more confidently than she felt. "I'd need help. Maybe Tommy could assist with prep work on the days I'm cooking for the camp. And I'd need to adjust the ranch meal schedule slightly, but I can make it work." Silas studied her. "Why do you want to do this? The money?" "Partly, but also because—" She struggled to find the right words. "The ranch is struggling. I see you up at night going over the books. I hear you arguing with suppliers about prices, and I can't do anything about the cattle or the fences or the bank, but I can do this. I can bring in money that might help ease some of the pressure. Evelyn, you don't have to—" "I know I don't have to. I want to. This ranch matters to me. You matter to me. And if I can help, then I'm going to help." He crossed the distance between them in 2 strides and pulled her into his arms. For a moment, they just stood there, holding each other in the quiet barn while the mare watched with patient eyes. "All right," he said quietly. "If you want to do this, I'll support you, but on one condition." "What's that?" "If it gets to be too much, you tell me. Don't push yourself until you break just because you're too stubborn to admit you need help. Same goes for you. He laughed, the sound rusty but genuine. Fair enough. 2 days later, Evelyn sent word to Abbott that she'd take the job. The first delivery was scheduled for the following Monday, which gave her exactly 4 days to figure out how to cook for 100 men while still managing her responsibilities at the ranch. She spent those 4 days in a frenzy of planning and preparation. She reorganized the entire kitchen to make the workflow more efficient. She convinced Silas to let her use one of the empty storage sheds as additional cooking space. She drafted Tommy and 2 other ranch hands to help with heavy lifting and transport. And she created detailed menus that would be filling, transportable, and wouldn't spoil during the journey to the mining camp. The first cook day arrived faster than she was ready for. Evelyn woke at 3 in the morning, lit every lantern in the kitchen, and got to work. By the time the ranch hands showed up for breakfast at 5:30, she already had 2 massive pots of beef stew simmering and was pulling the first batch of bread from the oven. "You trying to feed an army?" Cutter asked, eyeing the industrial-scale cooking operation with something that might have been respect. "Just 100 miners," Evelyn said, not looking up from the dough she was kneading. "Ranch breakfast is on the table. Help yourselves." The men ate quickly and cleared out, understanding without being told that they needed to stay out of her way. All except Tommy, who'd volunteered to spend the day helping her. By noon, Evelyn had produced enough food to feed a small battalion: 40 gallons of beef stew, 30 loaves of bread, 2 enormous pans of cornbread, and a batch of dried apple hand pies that would travel well. Her back ached, her feet were screaming, and she'd burned her hand twice on the oven door. But she'd done it. Abbott's men arrived right on schedule with a wagon to collect everything. They loaded it carefully, following Evelyn's instructions about which containers needed to stay upright and which could be stacked. The foreman handed her an envelope containing $50 in cash, more money than she'd ever held at one time in her life. After they left, Evelyn sank into a chair and just sat there, staring at the envelope. Tommy appeared with a cup of coffee and set it in front of her. "You did it," he said, sounding impressed. "First week down," Evelyn said. "About 100 more to go." But when Silas came into the kitchen that evening and saw the envelope sitting on the work table, his expression was worth every aching muscle and burned finger. "You actually pulled it off. Did you doubt me?" "Not for a second." He sat down across from her. "What are you going to do with it?" Evelyn had been thinking about that all day. "Half goes to ranch operations, help offset some of the losses from winter. The other half I'm saving." "Saving for what?" "I don't know yet. But for the first time in my life, I'm going to have savings. That means something." What she didn't say, what she couldn't quite articulate yet, was that having her own money meant having choices. It meant not being completely dependent on anyone else for survival. It meant security in a way she'd never experienced before. And security meant freedom. The arrangement with the mining camp continued through March and into April. Every Monday and Thursday, Evelyn transformed the ranch kitchen into a commercial cooking operation, producing massive quantities of food that Abbott's men collected like clockwork. The money piled up, week after week, and Evelyn started keeping it in a locked box under her bed. The ranch hands began calling those days Evelyn's War Days because of the military precision with which she ran the operation. Everyone knew to stay out of the kitchen unless they were helping, to eat breakfast early or late, and to not even think about complaining if lunch was simpler than usual. But the extra work was taking its toll. Evelyn was losing weight she couldn't afford to lose. Dark circles appeared under her eyes. And she moved through her days with a kind of grim determination that worried everyone who cared about her. Silas tried to get her to slow down, but she waved off his concerns. Frank suggested she hire additional help, but she insisted she could manage. Even Tommy, who'd been helping her faithfully, started looking worried. "You're going to work yourself to death," he said one Thursday as they packed the last of the food for delivery. "I'm serious, Evelyn. You look terrible." "Thanks for the compliment." "I'm not joking. When's the last time you slept more than 4 hours? When's the last time you sat down for a full meal instead of just grabbing bites while you work?" Evelyn couldn't remember. The days had started blurring together into one endless cycle of cooking, cleaning, planning, and cooking some more. "I'm fine," she said automatically. "You're not. And everyone knows it except apparently you." Before Evelyn could respond, a commotion in the yard drew their attention. She went to the window and saw a fancy carriage pulling up to the main house. completely out of place on a working ranch. A man climbed out, dressed in expensive clothes that marked him as someone important, or at least someone who thought he was important. Silas emerged from the barn, and even from a distance, Evelyn could see the tension in his shoulders as he approached the stranger. "Who's that?" Tommy asked. "No idea, but I don't think it's good news." She was right. The stranger turned out to be Victor Hale, the wealthiest landowner in the territory. He owned 3 massive ranches, a stake in the railroad, and enough political connections to make or break smaller operations like Boone Ridge. And he'd come personally to make Silas an offer. Evelyn learned all this later, after Hale had left and Silas appeared in the kitchen looking like he'd been kicked by a horse. He dropped into a chair without saying anything, his face ashen. "What happened?" Evelyn asked, alarmed. "Hale wants to buy the ranch, offered me less than half what it's worth, and made it very clear that if I don't sell, he'll make sure I regret it." "He threatened you?" "Not in so many words, but the message was clear enough." Silas rubbed his face with both hands. "He controls the railroad access in this region. He's got connections at the bank. He's friendly with half the suppliers I depend on. If he decides to squeeze me out, he can do it." Evelyn's blood ran cold. "So what are you going to do?" "Fight him. What else can I do? This ranch is all I've got. My wife and I built it from nothing. Every fence post, every building, every acre of cleared land represents years of our lives. I'm not handing it over to some land baron just because he's decided he wants it. But if he can cut off your access to supplies, then I'll find other suppliers. I'll drive cattle to different markets. I'll do whatever it takes." His hands were shaking slightly. "I just need time. Time to recover from winter, time to rebuild the herd, time to get back on solid financial footing. But time is exactly what Hale won't give me." Evelyn moved to stand behind him, resting her hands on his shoulders. She could feel the tension knotted in his muscles, the weight of impossible decisions pressing down on him. "We'll figure it out," she said quietly. "Somehow, we'll figure it out." But she had no idea how. Over the next few weeks, Hale's pressure campaign began in earnest. 2 of Silas's regular suppliers suddenly announced they could no longer do business with him, one citing scheduling conflicts, the other offering no explanation at all. The bank sent a letter demanding early payment on a loan that wasn't due for another 6 months. And rumors started circulating that Boone Ridge cattle were diseased, causing buyers to back away from deals that had been all but finalized. None of it was coincidence. Hale was systematically cutting off Silas's options, tightening the noose, waiting for him to crack. Silas responded with stubborn defiance, finding new suppliers at higher prices, negotiating payment plans with the bank, and personally visiting buyers to prove the health of his cattle. But the strain was showing. He was drinking more, sleeping less, and snapping at people who didn't deserve it. The ranch hands knew something was wrong, even if they didn't know the details. The atmosphere shifted from the cautious optimism of early spring to something darker and more uncertain. Men who'd been laughing and joking a month ago now worked in tense silence, wondering if they'd still have jobs by summer. And through it all, Evelyn kept cooking. For the ranch, for the mining camp, for everyone who depended on her. She cooked until her hands bled and her vision blurred with exhaustion. She cooked because it was the one thing she knew how to do, the one way she could help. But it wasn't enough. She could feel it in her bones. They were losing. Slowly but surely, Hale was winning. The breaking point came in late April. Evelyn was in the kitchen preparing dinner when Silas stormed in, a piece of paper crumpled in his fist. He slammed it down on the work table hard enough to make the dishes rattle. "The bank is calling in all my loans. Full payment due within 60 days or they seize the property." Evelyn stared at the paper, the words not quite processing. "They can't do that, can they?" And apparently they can. There's some clause buried in the contract about deteriorating financial conditions giving them the right to accelerate payment. His laugh was bitter. Hale must have called in every favor he had to make this happen. "How much do you owe?" $8,000. The number hit Evelyn like a physical blow. $8,000. It might as well have been $1 million. There was no way they could raise that kind of money in 60 days. Not with the ranch still recovering from winter. Not with Hale actively sabotaging every business deal they tried to make. "We could sell cattle," she said, grasping at straws. "Not enough time to get a fair price. Hale knows that. He's counting on me being desperate enough to accept whatever lowball offer he makes. Silas sank into a chair, looking defeated in a way she'd never seen before. He's won. I just don't know how to admit it yet. No, the word came out sharper than Evelyn intended. No, he hasn't won. Not yet. Evelyn, I have money from the mining camp. It's not $8,000, but it's something, maybe $1,500 saved up. That's a start. Silas looked at her like she'd lost her mind. I'm not taking your money. Why not? Because you worked yourself half to death to earn that. Because it's yours. Because... He broke off, shaking his head. It wouldn't be right. What wouldn't be right is letting some land baron steal your ranch because you're too proud to accept help. Evelyn moved to stand in front of him, forcing him to meet her eyes. You said we were in this together, remember? Together. That means my money is your money if it helps save this place. It's not enough anyway. Even with your savings, we'd still be 6,000 short. Then we find another 6,000. We sell cattle. We take out another loan. We ask Abbott if he'll pay in advance for the next few months. We do whatever it takes. Silas looked at her for a long moment, something complicated moving behind his eyes. Then he reached out and pulled her into his lap, holding her tight. How did I get so lucky? He murmured into her hair. You hired the desperate woman with the worn-out boots and the iron skillet. Not sure I'd call that lucky. I'd call it the best decision I ever made. They sat like that for a while, drawing strength from each other, until the smell of burning food from the stove sent Evelyn scrambling back to her feet. That night, after everyone else had gone to bed, Evelyn sat at the kitchen table with paper and pencil, running numbers. 1,500 from her savings. Maybe they could sell some of the younger cattle at a slight loss and get another 2,000. If they cut every possible expense and somehow scraped together another 1,000 from somewhere, that still left them 3,000 short. $3,000. It was an impossible amount, a sum that might as well have been pulled from thin air. Unless... An idea began forming in her mind. It was audacious, possibly insane, and absolutely risky, but it might be their only chance. The territorial governor was planning a major celebration in Helena next month, a political event bringing together wealthy investors, business leaders, and influential families from across Montana and beyond. It was the kind of gathering where deals were made, alliances formed, and fortunes changed hands. What if she could get a contract to cater the event? The thought made her hands shake. Catering for 100 miners was one thing. Catering for the territorial elite was something else entirely. The standards would be impossibly high, the scrutiny intense, and failure would be very public and very damaging. But if she could pull it off, if she could impress the right people, prove that a woman from a frontier ranch could produce food worthy of the wealthiest tables in the territory, it could open doors, contracts with hotels, government facilities, other wealthy families, the kind of steady, reliable business that could save the ranch and build something bigger. She needed to talk to Silas, and to Abbott, and probably to Frank, who seemed to know everyone in the territory. But first, she needed to figure out if this wild idea was even remotely possible. Evelyn pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and started making lists. Menu options, supplies needed, transportation logistics, staffing requirements. The more she wrote, the more real it became in her mind. This could work. It had to work, because the alternative was losing everything, and Evelyn had lost enough in her life. She wasn't about to lose the ranch, the man she loved, or the future she'd started to believe might actually be possible. The next morning, Evelyn presented her plan to Silas over breakfast. She laid out everything: the governor's celebration, the opportunity it represented, the risks involved, and the potential payoff if they succeeded. Silas listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he was quiet for so long that Evelyn started to worry she'd miscalculated. "You'd be putting yourself on display for the entire territory," he said finally. "The same people who've been gossiping about us, the same social circle that's tried to shun you. You understand that?" "I understand. And if something goes wrong, if the food isn't perfect, if there's any kind of problem, those people will tear you apart. They'll say it proves everything they've been saying about you being unfit for polite society." "I know. So why do it? Why risk that kind of humiliation?" Evelyn met his eyes. "Because I'm tired of hiding, tired of letting other people's opinions dictate what I can and can't do. and because this ranch deserves to survive, and you deserve to keep what you built. If making fancy food for rich people is what it takes, then that's what I'll do." Silas reached across the table and took her hand. "You're sure about this?" "I'm terrified," she admitted. "But yeah, I'm sure." "Then let's do it." The next few weeks were a blur of frantic preparation. Evelyn sent a formal proposal to the governor's office, detailing her experience and proposing an ambitious menu that would showcase the best of frontier cooking elevated to fine dining standards. To her shock, they responded within 3 days with an invitation to present a sample meal to the event planning committee. She had 1 week to prepare. Evelyn threw herself into the challenge with single-minded focus. She tested recipes obsessively, tweaking seasoning and presentation until everything was perfect. She practiced plating techniques, trying to make frontier ingredients look elegant enough for wealthy tables. She burned through supplies at an alarming rate, destroying batch after batch until she got it exactly right. The ranch hands watched this frenzy with a mixture of concern and fascination. Tommy appointed himself her official taste tester, offering brutally honest feedback that she actually appreciated. Frank helped her source specialty ingredients from suppliers across the territory. Even Cutter contributed, using his contacts from his previous life as a freight hauler to arrange transportation for equipment she needed. And Silas stood beside her through all of it, believing in her even when she doubted herself. The day of the presentation arrived faster than she was ready for. Evelyn rode into Helena with Silas, bringing carefully packed samples of her best work: herb-crusted beef with a wild mushroom reduction, butter-poached trout with spring vegetables, golden-crusted bread served with honey butter, and a delicate berry tart that had taken her 36 attempts to perfect. The planning committee consisted of 5 people: the governor's chief of staff, 2 society matrons from Helena's wealthiest families, a hotel manager, and a man Evelyn didn't recognize but who had the look of someone used to being important. They watched her set up with expressions ranging from skeptical to openly dismissive. One of the society women whispered something to her companion, and they both laughed. Evelyn ignored them and focused on the work. She plated each dish with steady hands, despite the fear churning in her stomach. This was it. Everything depended on the next few minutes. The committee tasted in silence, their faces revealing nothing. Evelyn stood there, her heart pounding so hard she was sure they could hear it. Finally, the governor's chief of staff looked up. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" "My grandmother taught me the basics. Everything else I learned through necessity." "Necessity? I've been cooking in boarding houses, railroad camps, and ranch kitchens since I was 16 years old. You learn fast when people's lives depend on you feeding them well." The hotel manager spoke up. "This is frontier cooking? It's honest cooking, good ingredients prepared with skill and care. That doesn't change whether you're cooking for cowboys or governors." The unknown man, who turned out to be a wealthy investor from San Francisco, smiled. "I like her. She's got nerve." The chief of staff conferred quietly with the others, then turned back to Evelyn. "Miss Mercer, we'd like to offer you the contract. Full catering for the governor's celebration, 150 guests, multi-course dinner, appetizers, and desserts. Can you handle that?" Evelyn felt Silas's hand find hers under the table, squeezing tight. "Yes, sir. I can handle it. The payment will be $1,500, half up front and half upon completion. Acceptable?" $1,500. For one event. It was more than she'd imagined. Very acceptable. After they left the meeting, Evelyn and Silas stood on the Helena street in stunned silence. "You did it," Silas said finally. "You actually did it." "I haven't done anything yet. I still have to actually pull off the event." "You will. I know you will." But as they climbed back into the wagon for the long ride home, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just made a promise she might not be able to keep. The promise haunted Evelyn for the next 2 weeks. 150 guests. Multi-course dinner. The territorial elite watching her every move, waiting for her to fail. And only 14 days to prepare for the most important event of her life. She started by breaking down the logistics into manageable pieces, but even that was overwhelming. The sheer volume of food required meant she couldn't possibly do this alone. She needed help, and not just Tommy peeling potatoes. She needed skilled workers who could follow instructions precisely, transport crews who could get everything to Helena safely, and a workspace large enough to handle industrial-scale cooking. The first problem she solved by recruiting ranch hands. Frank volunteered immediately, revealing that he'd worked in a hotel kitchen in Denver before coming to Montana. Two younger cowboys admitted they'd helped their mothers run boarding houses and knew their way around a stove. Even Cutter offered his services, though he made it clear he was doing it for Silas, not her. "Boss needs this to work," Cutter said bluntly, "so I'll do whatever needs doing, but I don't cook. I haul, I lift, I follow orders. That's it." "That's exactly what I need," Evelyn told him. For workspace, Silas cleared out the largest barn and helped her set up multiple cooking stations with temporary stoves borrowed from neighbors. It was crude, inefficient, and probably violated every safety regulation that existed, but it would have to work. The advance payment of $750 arrived via bank draft, and Evelyn immediately put it towards supplies and paying the ranch hands who'd volunteered to help. She insisted on this over Silas's objections. "They're doing extra work," she said firmly. "They deserve extra pay. Besides, if we're asking them to help save the ranch, they should benefit when we succeed." "You mean if we succeed?" "No, I mean when." But her confidence wavered when she actually started cooking. The first full-scale test run was a disaster. The timing was off, dishes came out at different temperatures, two of the sauces broke, and the desserts looked nothing like the elegant presentation she'd practiced. By the end of the day, Evelyn was ready to march back to Helena and tell them she'd made a terrible mistake. Silas found her sitting outside the barn at midnight, staring at nothing. "That bad?" he asked, settling down beside her. "Worse. I don't know what I was thinking, believing I could pull this off. I'm a ranch cook, not some fancy chef from San Francisco." "You're the woman who cooked breakfast over a campfire in the middle of winter after someone sabotaged your kitchen. You're the woman who's been feeding 100 miners twice a week while still managing all your responsibilities here. You're a lot of things, Evelyn, but incapable isn't one of them." "This is different. Those were just meals. It's supposed to be an experience. Art on a plate. I don't know how to do that." Silas was quiet for a moment. "You remember what you told that planning committee about honest cooking being good ingredients prepared with skill and care?" "Yeah." "So stick to that. Stop trying to be something you're not. Cook the way you know how. Just make it look prettier." It was such simple advice, but something about it clicked. Evelyn had been so focused on trying to match what she imagined wealthy people expected that she'd lost sight of what actually made her cooking good. She knew how to bring out the best in ingredients. She knew how to balance flavors. She knew how to feed people in a way that made them feel cared for. She just needed to trust that knowledge. The second test run went better. Not perfect, 2 dishes still needed work, and the plating was inconsistent, but significantly improved. By the third run, things were starting to click. The team developed a rhythm, learning to anticipate each other's movements and communicate without wasting words. Frank turned out to be invaluable, his hotel experience giving him insights into fine dining presentation that Evelyn lacked. Tommy had a surprisingly delicate touch when it came to garnishing, and Cutter, despite his protests about not cooking, proved to be excellent at managing the logistics of getting food from station to station at exactly the right moment. "You sure you've never done this before?" Evelyn asked after he orchestrated a particularly complex sequence of dishes without a single mistake. "Used to run freight for a catering company in Cheyenne. Learned real quick that timing matters more than anything else in this business." While Evelyn focused on the food, Silas handled everything else. He arranged transportation, secured the specialized equipment they'd need in Helena, and negotiated with local ranchers to borrow serving pieces and linens. He worked connections Evelyn hadn't even known he had, calling in favors and making deals that would help ensure the event's success. But the financial pressure was still crushing them. The bank's deadline was approaching with terrifying speed, and even with Evelyn's savings and the catering advance, they were still thousands of dollars short. Silas tried to hide how worried he was, but Evelyn could see it in the set of his shoulders, the tension in his jaw, the way he'd stare at the ledgers late at night like they might reveal some miracle solution. Then Victor Hale showed up again. It was 10 days before the governor's event. Evelyn was in the barn overseeing the 4th full-scale practice run when she heard raised voices from the direction of the main house. She wiped her hands on her apron and went to investigate, arriving just as Silas stepped out onto the porch to face Hale. "I'm not selling," Silas said, his voice cold. "I've told you that 3 times now. The answer isn't going to change. Hale smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. I'm trying to be reasonable here, Boone. My offer is fair, more than fair, considering your circumstances. Your offer is robbery, and we both know it. You've spent the last 2 months actively sabotaging my business. Don't pretend this is about fairness. I've done nothing illegal. If certain business relationships have evolved, that's just the market correcting itself. Hale's gaze shifted to Evelyn, who'd stopped a few yards away. Ah, Miss Mercer, I've heard quite a bit about you. Enterprising woman, from what I understand. Tell me, is it true you've secured a contract to cater the governor's celebration? Evelyn's stomach tightened, but she kept her voice steady. Word travels fast. In my circles, yes. I have friends on the planning committee. They mentioned hiring a ranch cook from Black Hollow. Quite the coup for someone in your position. There was something in the way he said it, a subtle emphasis on your position, that made Evelyn's skin crawl. Is there something you wanted, Mr. Hale? She asked. Because we're rather busy. Just wanted to offer my congratulations. And a word of friendly advice. He turned back to Silas. You're betting everything on this event, aren't you? The catering money, plus whatever contracts might come from impressing the right people. It's clever, risky, but clever. Get to the point, Silas said. The point is that you're gambling with very high stakes. If anything goes wrong, if the food doesn't meet expectations, if there's any kind of problem or embarrassment, you'll lose more than just the money. You'll lose any credibility you might have had with the people who matter in this territory. Hale's smile widened, and then you'll have no choice but to accept my offer, on whatever terms I choose to provide. We're not going to fail, Evelyn said before Silas could respond. Confident, I like that. But confidence doesn't always translate to competence, Miss Mercer. You're a ranch cook attempting to serve the territorial elite. That's quite a leap. He tipped his hat. Well, I wish you luck. You'll need it. After Hale left, Silas stood on the porch, staring after the departing carriage, his hands clenched into fists. He's going to try something, Evelyn said quietly. He didn't come all the way out here just to wish us luck. I know. What do we do? Silas turned to look at her, and she saw the same determination in his eyes that had first made her believe he was someone worth fighting for. We do the job. We do it better than anyone expects, and we don't give that bastard the satisfaction of seeing us fail. The next week was pure controlled chaos. Evelyn drove her team relentlessly, running practice after practice until every dish could be executed perfectly, even under pressure. She created backup plans for every possible disaster, extra ingredients in case something went wrong, alternative dishes if certain items became unavailable, detailed instructions so that others could step in if she became incapacitated. She barely slept, surviving on coffee and stubborn determination. Her clothes started hanging loose on her frame. The circles under her eyes deepened until she looked almost haunted. But every time someone suggested she slow down, she pushed harder. 3 days before the event, Abbott arrived at the ranch with unexpected news. Heard about the governor's dinner, he said, finding Evelyn in the barn. Wanted to let you know that I've been talking to some of the other mine operators in the territory. We're all impressed with your work, and we're all interested in expanding our arrangements with you. Evelyn paused in the middle of chopping vegetables. Expanding how? Daily deliveries instead of twice weekly, and we'd be willing to pay premium rates for consistent quality. He pulled out a folded contract. I took the liberty of drawing up a proposal. If you're interested, this represents commitments from 4 different mining operations. Total value of about $3,000 a month. $3,000? A month? The number was so absurd that Evelyn almost laughed. That's more than most ranchers make in a year. You're not most ranchers. You're running a business. A good one. And we want to be part of it. Abbott set the contract on the work table. No pressure. Look it over, talk to Silas, let me know what you think. But Evelyn, this is real. This could be the beginning of something much bigger than just cooking for the ranch. After he left, Evelyn stood staring at the contract, her hands shaking. This was what she'd been working toward without even realizing it. Not just survival, but actual prosperity. The kind of success that could change everything. But first, she had to get through the governor's dinner without disaster. The team departed for Helena 2 days before the event, taking 3 wagons loaded with equipment, supplies, and enough food to feed a small army. Silas rode alongside Evelyn's wagon, keeping her company during the long journey. You ready for this? He asked. No, but I'm doing it anyway. That's pretty much been your approach to everything since you got here. Evelyn managed a tired smile. It's worked so far. They arrived in Helena in the late afternoon and immediately set up in the venue's kitchen, a hotel ballroom that had been converted for the event. The kitchen facilities were better than anything Evelyn had worked with before, but they were also unfamiliar. She spent the first few hours just figuring out where everything was and how the equipment worked. That night, she lay awake in the hotel room Silas had insisted on getting for her, staring at the ceiling and running through every possible thing that could go wrong. Food poisoning, fires, dishes arriving cold, running out of ingredients, hail sabotaging the event somehow. Her mind spiraled through disaster after disaster until she wanted to scream. A soft knock on the door broke through her anxiety. She opened it to find Silas standing there in his shirt sleeves, looking as exhausted as she felt. Couldn't sleep either? He asked. Too much to think about. Mind if I come in? She stepped aside to let him enter. He crossed to the window and looked out at Helena's gas-lit streets, his hands in his pockets. When my wife died, he said quietly, I spent about 6 months convinced that everything good in my life was over. The ranch felt empty. The work felt meaningless. I kept going through the motions because I didn't know what else to do, but I was just hollow. Evelyn moved to stand beside him. What changed? Time, mostly, and realizing that she would have been furious with me for giving up. She fought so hard to live, to keep building the ranch with me. Letting it all fall apart would have dishonored that fight. He turned to look at Evelyn. And then you showed up, and for the first time in years, I felt like maybe there could be good things ahead. Like maybe the story wasn't over after all. Silas, I'm saying this wrong. What I mean is, tomorrow is going to be hard. Maybe the hardest thing either of us has ever done. But whatever happens, we're in it together. And that matters more than any dinner or any contract or any amount of money. Evelyn felt tears pricking at her eyes. If we fail tomorrow, we lose everything. Then we'll rebuild from nothing. We've both done it before. I don't want to lose the ranch. I don't want to lose what we've built. Neither do I, so we'll fight like hell to keep it. He pulled her close. But if the worst happens, we'll still have each other, and that's not nothing. They stood like that for a long time, drawing strength from each other, until Evelyn finally felt steady enough to believe she might actually survive the next day. The morning of the governor's celebration arrived with perfect weather, clear skies, mild temperature, a light breeze that would keep the ballroom from getting too stuffy. Evelyn took it as a good sign, though she was too nervous to eat any breakfast. Her team assembled in the hotel kitchen at 6 in the morning. Evelyn had planned everything down to the minute, creating a detailed timeline that would ensure each course was prepared, plated, and served at exactly the right temperature and exactly the right time. All right, she said, looking around at the faces of the people who'd worked so hard to make this possible. You all know what to do. Trust your training, trust each other, and don't panic if something goes wrong. We've got backup plans for everything. Just stay focused and we'll get through this. Frank raised his coffee cup. To the best damn cook in Montana. To Evelyn, Tommy echoed. Even Cutter nodded. Let's show these fancy folks what real cooking looks like. Work began immediately. Evelyn moved through the kitchen like a general commanding troops, her voice calm but authoritative as she directed the controlled chaos. Meat went into ovens at precisely calculated times. Vegetables were prepped and staged. Sauces were started, tasted, adjusted. Bread came out golden and perfect. Desserts were assembled with painstaking care. As the hours passed, the kitchen filled with incredible smells. Rich, savory, complex. The kind of aromas that made people stop whatever they were doing just to appreciate them. At noon, the first guests began arriving. Evelyn could hear the murmur of voices and laughter from the ballroom, but she didn't have time to think about who might be out there. She had appetizers to finish. The first course went out exactly on schedule. Delicate salmon on crisp rounds of bread, garnished with fresh herbs and a touch of lemon. Evelyn held her breath, waiting for... she didn't know what. Complaints? Someone sending food back? Instead, one of the servers returned with an empty tray and a smile. They loved it, asking what's coming next. Relief flooded through her, but she didn't have time to celebrate. The next course was already being plated. The dinner progressed with mechanical precision. Each course was prepared, presented, and served without a single major problem. There were small issues, a sauce that needed last-minute adjustment, a garnish that didn't look quite right, but nothing catastrophic. Evelyn was so focused on the work that she barely registered time passing. One moment it was early afternoon, the next it was evening, and they were plating the final dessert course, individual berry tarts with a honey cream sauce and candied flower petals. She'd practiced this dish so many times she could do it with her eyes closed, but her hand still shook slightly as she arranged the final plate. This was it. The last impression. The thing people would remember when they talked about the dinner later. The tarts went out, and Evelyn finally allowed herself to lean against the work table, every muscle in her body screaming with exhaustion. "We did it," Frank said, sounding almost surprised. "We actually did it." "Don't jinx it," Tommy warned. "They haven't left yet." But 20 minutes later, the governor's chief of staff appeared in the kitchen doorway. The entire team froze, waiting for his verdict. "Miss Mercer," he said formally, "the governor would like to meet you." Evelyn's heart stopped. "Now?" "If you're available." She looked down at herself, apron-stained, hair falling out of its pins, exhausted beyond measure. "I'm not exactly presentable. You look like someone who's been working hard. That's exactly what the governor wants to see. Come on." Silas appeared from somewhere and took her hand. "I'm coming with you." They followed the chief of staff into the ballroom, and Evelyn's first impression was overwhelming noise and light. The room was packed with people in expensive clothes, all talking and laughing, the air thick with cigar smoke and perfume. The governor stood near the center of the room, a tall man with graying hair and sharp eyes. When he saw Evelyn approaching, he excused himself from his conversation and came to meet her. "Miss Mercer, that was one of the finest meals I've had in years. Truly exceptional." Evelyn managed a shaky curtsy. "Thank you, sir. I'm honored." "No, the honor is ours. You've shown these people that Montana Territory produces more than just cattle and minerals. We produce excellence." He raised his voice slightly. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce Evelyn Mercer, the culinary genius behind tonight's extraordinary dinner." The room erupted in applause. Evelyn stood there, overwhelmed, as some of the wealthiest and most powerful people in the territory clapped for her, for the food she'd made, for work she'd done with her own hands. And in that moment, something shifted inside her. These people weren't better than her. They weren't superior because they had money, or status, or fine clothes. They were just people, and they'd loved what she created. After the governor released them, Evelyn and Silas made their way back toward the kitchen, but they were stopped every few feet by guests wanting to compliment the meal, ask about hiring her for private events, or simply shake her hand. One of those guests was a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s who introduced herself as Catherine Morrison, owner of the Grand Northern Hotel chain. "I'd like to discuss a business arrangement," Morrison said bluntly. "My hotels across the territory need consistent quality food service. Your cooking tonight proved you can deliver that. I'm prepared to offer you a contract worth $10,000 a year if you can provide what I need." Evelyn's mind went blank. $10,000. A year. The number was incomprehensible. I'd need to think about it, discuss it with my business partner." She gestured to Silas. Morrison pulled out a calling card. "Take your time, but not too much time. I'm not the only one who's going to want to hire you after tonight." She was right. By the time Evelyn and Silas finally escaped the ballroom, she had 7 business cards in her pocket and verbal offers for contracts that added up to more money than she'd ever imagined making in her entire life. In the kitchen, her team was celebrating with the leftover wine the hotel had provided. When they saw Evelyn, they erupted in cheers. "Did you see those people?" Tommy crowed. "They couldn't stop talking about the food." "Best night of my life," Frank admitted, looking slightly drunk. "Cooking for the governor. Never thought I'd do something like that." Even Cutter was smiling, actually smiling. "You pulled it off, Evelyn. Against all odds, you actually pulled it off." Evelyn looked around at these people who'd worked so hard, who'd believed in her when she'd barely believed in herself, and felt emotion welling up in her chest. "We pulled it off," she corrected. "Every single one of you made this happen, and I won't forget that." Later that night, after everyone else had gone to bed, Evelyn and Silas sat in the hotel's courtyard, looking up at the stars. "So what happens now?" Silas asked. "Now we go home, pay off the bank, save the ranch." Evelyn leaned against his shoulder. "And then we figure out what comes next. You've got enough contract offers to make you rich. You could leave the ranch, start your own restaurant, become someone important. I'm already someone important. I'm the cook at Boone Ridge Ranch, the woman who fell in love with a stubborn rancher who refused to give up even when everything was falling apart. She turned to look at him. I'm not leaving. Not even for $10,000 a year? I'll make $10,000 a year and still live at the ranch. I'll hire people to help, build a real commercial kitchen, turn this into a legitimate business. But I'm not leaving. Silas pulled her close and kissed the top of her head. Thank God. Because I don't know what I'd do without you. 2 days later, they returned to Black Hollow with the final payment from the catering contract, the advance payments from 3 new business deals, and enough momentum to carry them into a future that looked nothing like the desperate struggle they'd been living. The bank accepted their payment without comment. The loans were satisfied, the ranch was safe, and Victor Hale's attempt to steal everything they'd built had failed completely. But the real victory came a week after they returned home, when a reporter from the Montana Territorial Gazette arrived asking to interview Evelyn for a feature story. The article ran 2 weeks later under the headline, From Ranch Cook to Culinary Pioneer, the Evelyn Mercer Story. It detailed her journey from arriving in Black Hollow with nothing to becoming one of the most sought-after food producers in the territory. It mentioned her partnership with Silas, her contracts with mining operations and hotels, and the governor's personal endorsement of her work. When copies of the paper reached Black Hollow, the gossip that had plagued Evelyn for months died almost overnight. Hard to talk about someone being a disgrace when the territorial newspaper was calling her a pioneer. Mrs. Whitmore, Evelyn heard through the town grapevine, had taken to her bed with a nervous condition and wasn't receiving visitors. Victor Hale left Montana Territory 3 weeks later, his reputation damaged and his business deals unraveling. Word was he'd overextended himself trying to acquire Boone Ridge and several other properties, and when his schemes failed, his creditors had come calling. He sold off his assets at a loss and disappeared somewhere back east. Evelyn felt no triumph at his downfall, just relief that he was gone. The ranch itself transformed over the following months. With money finally coming in steadily, Silas was able to make repairs that had been put off for years, buy better equipment, and even hire additional ranch hands. The operation became more efficient, more profitable, more sustainable. And Evelyn's food business, which she'd started calling Quinn and Boone Supply Company, using her mother's maiden name, grew beyond anything she'd imagined. The commercial kitchen Silas built for her became the heart of a small empire, producing everything from smoked meats to preserved vegetables to specialty baked goods for customers across the territory. She hired workers from Black Hollow, paying fair wages and creating jobs where none had existed before. Young women who'd had no prospects beyond marriage or domestic service suddenly had the opportunity to learn a trade and earn their own money. And through it all, Evelyn never forgot what it felt like to arrive in Montana with nothing but a carpetbag and an iron skillet, terrified and alone, facing a world that had already decided she wasn't worth much. That memory kept her humble, kept her honest, kept her fighting for everyone who'd ever been dismissed or overlooked or told they'd never amount to anything. Because she knew better than anyone that the world was wrong about a lot of things. Success, Evelyn discovered, brought its own kind of problems. Within 6 months of the governor's dinner, Quinn and Boone Supply Company was operating at a scale that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. The commercial kitchen Silas had built was running 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. Evelyn had hired 8 workers, mostly women from Black Hollow and the surrounding area who'd never had access to decent-paying work before. Orders came in faster than they could fill them, and Evelyn found herself turning away business because they simply didn't have the capacity. It was a good problem to have, but it was still a problem. "We need to expand," she told Silas one evening in late September. They were sitting in the ranch office, going over the books. Outside, the first hints of autumn were coloring the landscape, reminding them that another winter was coming. "The kitchen's too small. We're maxed out on production, and I've got 3 new contracts I can't accept because we don't have the space or equipment." Silas leaned back in his chair, studying the ceiling. How much would expansion cost? At least $5,000. Maybe more if we want to do it right. Proper equipment, enough space to double our current output, storage facilities that can handle larger inventory. We've got the money. I know, but it's a big investment. If something goes wrong, if the contracts don't pan out, then we'll deal with it, same as we've dealt with everything else. Silas looked at her, a slight smile on his face. "You're not scared of success, are you?" The question hit closer to home than Evelyn wanted to admit. She'd spent so long fighting to survive, to prove herself, to claw her way up from nothing. Now that she'd actually made it, some part of her kept waiting for it all to fall apart. Maybe a little, she admitted. It feels too good. Like something's going to go wrong just to balance things out. Life doesn't work that way. Sometimes good things just keep happening because you worked hard and earned them. He reached across the desk and took her hand. Build the expansion. Hire more people. Take the contracts. You've earned the right to think bigger. So she did. Construction on the new facility began in early October. Silas hired a crew from Helena, experienced builders who'd worked on commercial projects before and knew what they were doing. The new building went up quickly, taking shape beside the original kitchen like a promise made solid. While the construction was underway, Evelyn received an unexpected visitor. She was in the kitchen supervising the day's production when one of the workers came to find her. "There's a woman here to see you, says her name is Margaret Chen." Evelyn wiped her hands and went out to find the dressmaker from Black Hollow standing in the yard, looking slightly out of place among the ranch buildings and workers. "Mrs. Chen, this is a surprise." Margaret smiled. "I hope it's not an unwelcome one. I came to make a proposal, if you have a few minutes." They sat in the ranch house parlor, a room that had been barely furnished when Evelyn first arrived, but was now comfortable and lived in. Margaret accepted coffee and got straight to business. "I've been watching what you've built here with great interest, what you're doing for the women you've hired, giving them real jobs, real money, real independence. It's important work. I'm just running a business. You're changing lives. Those women have options now they never had before, and I want to be part of it." Margaret set down her cup. "I'd like to open a dressmaking school in Black Hollow, a place where women can learn a skilled trade, same as men learn carpentry or blacksmithing. But I need backing, someone with credibility and resources who believes in the idea." Evelyn understood immediately. "You want me to invest? I want you to partner with me. Your name carries weight now. If Evelyn Mercer says something is worthwhile, people listen. Together, we could create something that outlasts both of us." It was tempting, more than tempting. Evelyn had learned firsthand how limited women's options were, how few paths existed beyond marriage or domestic service. A school that taught real skills, that gave women the ability to support themselves, that could change everything for the next generation. How much would you need? $2,000 to start. Enough to secure a building, buy equipment, and run for the first year while we build enrollment. $2,000. A year ago, that would have been an impossible sum. Now it was actually within reach. "Let me talk to Silas, but I'm interested. Very interested." After Margaret left, Evelyn sat in the parlor thinking about how strange her life had become. A year and a half ago, she'd been terrified about spending $2 on a room at a boarding house. Now she was considering investing thousands in a business venture that had nothing to do with cooking. When she presented the idea to Silas that evening, he barely hesitated. "Do it. If you believe in it, do it. It's a lot of money for something that might not work out. So is expanding this kitchen. So is catering the governor's dinner. You've got good instincts, Evelyn. Trust them." The partnership with Margaret was formalized a week later. The dressmaking school opened in a converted storefront in Black Hollow 2 months after that, with 6 students in the first class. Within a year, it would have 20. But before that happened, something else occurred that changed everything. It was a cold November evening when Silas asked Evelyn to take a walk with him. They bundled up in heavy coats and headed out across the ranch, their breath visible in the freezing air. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed almost too beautiful to be real. "Where are we going?" Evelyn asked after they'd been walking for about 10 minutes. "You'll see." He led her to a small rise overlooking the valley where the ranch sprawled out below them. From this vantage point, you could see everything: the main house, the barns, the bunkhouses, the new commercial kitchen taking shape, the cattle scattered across the hills. It was a view of everything they'd built together, everything they'd fought to keep. Silas stopped and turned to face her, suddenly looking nervous in a way she'd never seen before. "I've been thinking about something for a while now," he said. "About us and what we are to each other, and how to make that official in a way that matters." Evelyn's heart started pounding. "Silas!" "Let me get this out before I lose my nerve." He pulled something from his pocket, a simple gold band that caught the fading light. "When my first wife died, I didn't think I'd ever want to marry again. Didn't think I could handle caring about someone that much, knowing I might lose them. But then you showed up and you were so damn stubborn and capable and brave that I couldn't help falling for you." He took her hand, his fingers warm despite the cold. "You're my partner in every way that matters. You've saved this ranch as much as I have. You've built something amazing from nothing but skill and determination, and I want to spend the rest of my life watching you do impossible things and being there to support you when things get hard." He dropped to one knee, and Evelyn felt tears starting to blur her vision. "Evelyn Mercer, will you marry me?" She wanted to say yes immediately, but the words caught in her throat. Because saying yes meant admitting she believed in this, believed it could last, believed she deserved this kind of happiness. And some part of her, the part that had been hurt and disappointed too many times, was still scared. "I'm not easy to live with," she said, her voice shaking. "I work too much. I'm stubborn. I don't know how to just relax and be happy because I'm always waiting for the next crisis." "I know. I've been living with you for over a year. I'm aware of your flaws." Silas smiled. "You're also brilliant and brave and more determined than anyone I've ever met. You make me want to be better. You make this ranch feel like a home instead of just a place I work. So yeah, you're stubborn and you work too hard. I'll take that deal every day for the rest of my life." Evelyn looked down at him kneeling in the dirt, at the ring in his hand, at the life he was offering her. And she realized that at some point she'd stopped being the terrified woman who'd stepped off that stagecoach with nothing but a carpet bag and a skillet. She'd become someone who could accept good things without constantly waiting for them to be taken away. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll marry you." Silas stood and pulled her into a kiss that was somehow both gentle and fierce, a promise and a celebration all at once. When they finally broke apart, both of them were crying and laughing at the same time. He slipped the ring onto her finger, and Evelyn stared at it in the fading light, still not quite believing this was real. "When?" she asked. "Whenever you want. Tomorrow, next month, next year. I'm not picky." "Spring," Evelyn decided, "after winter, when everything starts growing again. That feels right." They walked back to the ranch hand in hand, and by the time they reached the house, word had somehow already spread. The ranch hands were waiting, grinning, and offering congratulations. Frank produced a bottle of whiskey he'd been saving for a special occasion. Even Cutter cracked a smile and muttered something about it being about damn time. That night, as Evelyn lay in bed wearing Silas's ring and listening to the wind outside, she thought about how far she'd come. From Ohio to Black Hollow. From desperate and alone to engaged and successful. From worthless in the eyes of society to someone people respected. But the journey wasn't over yet. Winter came hard and fast that year, but this time the ranch was ready. They had plenty of supplies, better facilities, and enough money saved to weather any crisis. The cattle were healthier, the buildings were in good repair, and there was a sense of stability that had been missing in previous years. Evelyn and her team continued producing for Quinn and Boone Supply Company through the winter, though at a slightly reduced schedule. The new facility was completed in January, and they spent a week moving equipment and supplies, reorganizing workflow, and training workers on the new systems. The expansion immediately paid off. With more space and better equipment, they could fulfill orders that had been impossible before. Catherine Morrison's hotel contracts expanded. The mining camps increased their orders. New customers came seeking everything from preserved foods to specialty baked goods to catered events. By February, Evelyn had 12 workers on payroll and was considering hiring more. But she was also exhausted in a way that went bone deep. Running a rapidly growing business while planning a wedding while managing the ranch kitchen was taking a toll. She'd developed a persistent cough she couldn't shake, and she'd lost more weight despite eating regularly. Silas noticed, of course. He always noticed. "You need to slow down," he said one evening after she'd been working for 14 hours straight. "I will, after the wedding, after we get through spring orders, after—" "Evelyn." He took her hands, making her stop and look at him. "You're burning out. I can see it. Everyone can see it. And if you don't slow down, you're going to make yourself seriously ill." "I'm fine." "You're not. And you know it." His voice was gentle but firm. "You've built something incredible. You've hired good people who can help carry the load. Let them. Trust them to do their job so you can do yours without killing yourself." He was right. Evelyn knew he was right. But letting go of control was terrifying. What if something went wrong? What if the quality dropped? What if customers stopped trusting them because she wasn't personally overseeing everything? I don't know how, she admitted quietly. Start small. Delegate one thing, then another. You don't have to do it all at once. So she tried. She promoted one of her workers, a sharp woman named Ruth, who had a natural talent for organization, to supervisor. Ruth would oversee daily operations, handle scheduling, and make sure quality standards were maintained. Evelyn would still approve menus and new products, but she wouldn't be in the kitchen 12 hours a day. It was harder than she'd expected, stepping back. The first few days, she kept finding excuses to check on things, to make sure Ruth was handling everything properly. But gradually, she learned to trust. And Ruth proved herself more than capable. With more time freed up, Evelyn could focus on other things, like planning her wedding. She and Margaret designed a dress together, simple but elegant, made from cream-colored silk that Margaret sourced from San Francisco. It wasn't fancy by the standards of wealthy society women, but it was the nicest thing Evelyn had ever worn. The wedding was planned for the first Saturday in May, when the weather would be mild and the ranch would be at its most beautiful. They kept it simple, just a ceremony at the ranch, followed by a celebration with the ranch hands and their friends from town. But as the date approached, Evelyn felt an unexpected nervousness. Not about marrying Silas, she was absolutely certain about that, but about being the center of attention, about standing in front of people and making promises that would change the shape of her entire life. The night before the wedding, she couldn't sleep. She got up and wandered into the kitchen, seeking comfort in the familiar space. Her grandmother's iron skillet hung on the wall where it had hung since her first day at the ranch. She took it down and ran her fingers over the smooth, worn surface. "Wish you could be here," she whispered to the memory of her grandmother. "Wish you could see how things turned out." She heard footsteps and turned to find Frank standing in the doorway, looking slightly sheepish. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked. "Too much thinking." He came in and poured himself coffee from the pot that was always warm on the stove. "You nervous?" "A little. Not about Silas, just about everything changing." Frank sat down at the work table, gesturing for her to join him. "Can I tell you something? When you first showed up here, I gave you 2 weeks. Maybe 3 if you were tougher than you looked. There was just no way, I thought, that a woman who looked like you'd been through hard times was going to survive out here. Thanks for the vote of confidence." He smiled. "But you proved me wrong, proved everyone wrong. And you know what I realized? It wasn't that you were tougher than we thought, though you are. It's that you understood something most people don't." "What's that?" "That survival isn't about being the strongest or the smartest or having the most advantages. It's about refusing to quit when everything's telling you to give up. It's about finding one more day of strength, one more solution, one more reason to keep fighting." He took a sip of coffee. "That's what you've been doing since you got here, and that's what you'll keep doing after tomorrow. Marriage doesn't change that." Evelyn felt tears pricking at her eyes. "When did you get so wise?" "I've always been wise. You just weren't listening before." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, and when Evelyn finally went back to bed, she felt calmer, ready. The wedding day arrived with perfect weather, warm sunshine, clear blue skies, a gentle breeze that carried the scent of wildflowers across the ranch. Evelyn stood in her room, looking at herself in the mirror, barely recognizing the woman in the elegant dress with flowers in her hair. Margaret had come to help her get ready, fussing with the dress and making small adjustments until everything was perfect. "You look beautiful," Margaret said quietly. "I look different." "You look happy. There's a difference." There was a knock on the door, and Ruth stuck her head in. "Everyone's ready when you are." Evelyn took a deep breath, picked up the small bouquet of wildflowers that Tommy had gathered that morning, and stepped outside. The ceremony was held in the front yard, with the ranch spread out behind them as a backdrop. Chairs had been set up in rows, filled with ranch hands and workers from Quinn and Boone Supply Company and people from Black Hollow who'd made the journey out. Evelyn spotted Abbott and his wife, Catherine Morrison, Margaret's students from the dressmaking school, even some of the miners who'd been eating her cooking for the past year. And at the front, standing with the justice of the peace who'd agreed to officiate, was Silas. He was wearing his best suit, his hair neatly combed, and when he saw Evelyn walking toward him, his whole face lit up with a smile that made her feel like the most important person in the world. Frank appeared at her elbow, offering his arm. "Figured you might want someone to walk with you." "Thank you," she whispered. They walked together down the makeshift aisle, And when Frank handed her off to Silas, he winked. "Take care of her, boss. She's tougher than both of us put together." The ceremony itself was simple. Traditional vows spoken in voices that shook slightly with emotion. The exchange of rings, Silas had gotten one for himself that matched Evelyn's. And then the justice of the peace pronouncing them husband and wife, telling Silas he could kiss his bride. The kiss was sweet and gentle and full of promise. When they broke apart, the crowd erupted in applause and cheers. Evelyn Mercer had become Evelyn Boone. The celebration that followed was loud, joyful, and completely unpretentious. Tables had been set up outside loaded with food, some prepared by Evelyn's team, some contributed by guests, all delicious. Someone had brought a fiddle, and music filled the air. People danced and laughed and told stories, celebrating not just the wedding, but everything it represented. At one point, Evelyn found herself standing slightly apart from the crowd, just watching. Tommy was dancing with Ruth, both of them laughing at something. Frank was telling an animated story to a group of ranch hands. Margaret was in deep conversation with Catherine Morrison, probably discussing business. And Silas was making his rounds, thanking people for coming, looking more relaxed than she'd seen him in months. This was her family, now. Not related by blood, but by choice and shared struggle and mutual respect. These were her people. Mrs. Whitmore had not been invited, Evelyn noted with satisfaction. In fact, none of Black Hollow's self-appointed social elite had made an appearance. They'd been pointedly excluded, and Evelyn felt no guilt about it whatsoever. As the sun began to set, Silas found her and pulled her onto the makeshift dance floor. They swayed together to a slow song, not particularly gracefully, but neither of them cared. "Happy?" he asked. "Extremely." "No regrets?" "Not a single one." He kissed her forehead. "Good. Because you're stuck with me now. I can think of worse fates." The celebration lasted well into the night, finally winding down around midnight, when the last guests either headed home or found places to sleep in the bunkhouses. Evelyn and Silas retreated to the main house, exhausted but happy, ready to start their life together as husband and wife. The years that followed were good ones, though not without challenges. Quinn and Boone Supply Company continued to grow, expanding into new markets and new products. Evelyn hired more workers, eventually employing over 30 people across 2 facilities. The business made her wealthy by anyone's standards, though she never lost the careful frugality of someone who'd once survived on almost nothing. The ranch thrived too. Silas expanded the cattle operation, bought additional land, and modernized the facilities. Boone Ridge became known as one of the best-run ranches in Montana Territory, a reputation built on hard work and smart management. Margaret's dressmaking school flourished, eventually expanding to offer other trades: bookkeeping, telegraph operation, even basic legal training. It became a pipeline for young women seeking independence and opportunity, sending graduates across the territory and beyond. And through it all, Evelyn and Silas built a life together. They had their fights. 2 stubborn people living and working together were bound to clash sometimes. But they always worked through it, always came back to the fundamental trust and respect that had brought them together in the first place. Children came too, though not easily. Evelyn suffered 2 miscarriages before finally carrying a pregnancy to term. Their daughter was born in the spring of 1876, a squalling, red-faced baby they named Clara, after Evelyn's grandmother. 2 years later came a son, James, who had his father's build and his mother's determination. Evelyn discovered that motherhood was harder than running a business or managing a kitchen or any of the other challenges she'd faced. Babies were unpredictable, demanding, and terrifying in their vulnerability. She had no idea what she was doing most of the time, learning through trial and error and the advice of other mothers. But she also found unexpected joy in it, in Claire's first laugh, in James's determination to walk before he was ready, in the way both children looked at her like she could solve any problem in the world. She cut back her hours at Quinn and Boone Supply Company, delegating more to Ruth and the other supervisors. It was hard letting go of that control, but necessary. Her children needed her, and she refused to be the kind of mother who was too busy to actually be present. The business didn't suffer from her reduced involvement. If anything, it got stronger as her employees stepped up and proved themselves capable of running things without constant oversight. By 1880, Evelyn was 35 years old and could look back on a decade that had transformed her entire life. She was a successful businesswoman, a wife, a mother, and someone who was genuinely respected throughout Montana territory. But she never forgot where she'd come from. She made a point of hiring women who reminded her of herself, the ones who'd been beaten down by life, who arrived with nothing, who just needed someone to give them a chance. She paid fair wages, maintained good working conditions, and created opportunities for advancement. Some people called her soft for it, but Evelyn didn't care. She knew what it was like to be dismissed as worthless, and she refused to perpetuate that kind of cruelty. She also stayed connected to the ranch in ways that mattered. She still cooked for the ranch hands occasionally, especially during roundup or other busy times. She still walked the property with Silas, discussing plans and problems. She still felt that deep connection to the land and the life they'd built there. On a warm evening in June of 1881, Evelyn stood in the original ranch kitchen, the one where she'd cooked that first meal over 8 years ago. The space was smaller now, almost quaint compared to the commercial facilities she worked with regularly. But it was still used for family meals and small gatherings. Her grandmother's iron skillet hung on the wall, exactly where it had always been. Clara, now 5 years old, tugged on Evelyn's skirt. "Mama, why do you keep that old pan? We have nicer ones." Evelyn lifted her daughter onto the work table so they were eye to eye. "That skillet belonged to your great-grandmother. She used it to cook for her family for 40 years. And when she gave it to me, she told me that a good woman makes a good home wherever she goes." "What does that mean?" "It means home isn't a place. It's what you build with the people you love, no matter where you are or how hard things get." Evelyn ran her hand over the skillet's smooth surface. "When I came to this ranch, all I had was this skillet and the skills my grandmother taught me. I was scared and alone, and everyone thought I wouldn't last a week." "But you did." "I did. Because I remembered what she told me. I made this kitchen my home. I made this ranch my home. And eventually, I made a whole life here that I never could have imagined when I first arrived." Clara looked at the skillet with new respect. "Can I use it someday?" "Someday. When you're old enough to understand that it's not just a pan, it's a reminder that you're stronger than you think you are, that you can build something good even when everything seems impossible." James wandered in, sticky with something that might have been honey. Evelyn sighed and went to clean him up, but she was smiling. This was her life now, messy, chaotic, full of small disasters and unexpected joys. So different from the lonely struggle of those first months at the ranch. That night, after the children were in bed, Evelyn and Silas sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. The ranch stretched out before them, peaceful in the evening light. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been?" Silas asked. "If you'd gotten off that stagecoach in a different town, or if I'd hired someone else that day?" "Sometimes, but I try not to dwell on it. What ifs don't change what is." "True enough." He took her hand. "I'm glad you got off the stagecoach here. Glad you were stubborn enough to stay, even when everyone expected you to quit. I'm glad you gave me the chance to prove myself." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the kind of peace that comes from years of knowing someone completely. Then Evelyn said, "Do you remember what you asked me the night before the bank was going to seize the ranch? You asked if I had any regrets." "I remember. I said no then, but I don't think I really understood what that meant. Now I do." She turned to look at him. "I don't regret any of it. Not the hard parts, not the times I wanted to quit, not the struggles or the failures, or the moments when everything seemed hopeless. Because all of it, every single difficult, painful, exhausting moment led here, to this life, to you and the children and the business and everything we've built. Even Cutter sabotaging your kitchen that first month?" Evelyn laughed. "Even that. Because it taught me I was tougher than I thought I was, that I could handle crisis and keep going. You're still tough, toughest person I know. So are you. We make a good team. The best." As darkness fell and the stars began appearing overhead, Evelyn thought about the woman she'd been when she first arrived at Boone Ridge Ranch. That terrified, desperate woman carrying nothing but a carpet bag and an iron skillet, certain she was one mistake away from complete ruin. She wanted to go back and tell that woman that everything was going to be okay, better than okay. That the mockery and the fear and the loneliness were temporary, but the strength she'd find in herself would last forever. She wanted to tell her that the town gossips would eventually stop mattering, that the people who dismissed her would eventually have to acknowledge her success, that the future held more happiness than she could imagine. But that woman wouldn't have believed it. She'd been too beaten down by life, too convinced that good things happen to other people but never to her. So instead, Evelyn made a different promise. She promised to remember that feeling of being worthless and overlooked, so she'd never inflict it on anyone else. She promised to stay humble even as success grew, to remember where she'd come from even as she built toward where she was going. She promised to create opportunities for other women who needed chances, the way she'd needed a chance all those years ago. And most importantly, she promised to teach her children that worth isn't something bestowed by society or determined by circumstances. It's something you prove to yourself through action, through perseverance, through refusing to accept other people's limitations on who you can become. Over the years, Evelyn watched other women arrive in Montana Territory the way she had. Broken, desperate, running from something or toward something, carrying whatever they could salvage from the wreckage of their old lives. She hired as many as she could, gave them work and wages and the chance to rebuild. Some thrived, some struggled and eventually moved on, but all of them got the opportunity to try, and that mattered. She also made sure Clara and James understood their own privilege. Yes, they'd been born into success, but their mother hadn't been. She told them stories about the hard years, about cooking over a campfire in winter, about being mocked and dismissed and told she'd never amount to anything. "Why did people say those things?" Clara asked once. "Because they saw what I looked like on the outside and decided that was all I was. They saw someone heavy and poor and desperate, and they assumed that meant I was worthless." "But you weren't." "No, but it took me a long time to really believe that." Evelyn pulled her daughter close. "That's why I need you to understand something important. How you look, how much money you have, where you come from. None of that determines your value. What matters is how you treat people, what you build with your hands and your mind, and whether you leave the world a little better than you found it. Did you leave it better?" "I'm trying. Every day, I'm trying." By the time Evelyn reached her 40s, Quinn and Boone Supply Company employed over 60 people and operated in 4 different cities across Montana Territory. The ranch had expanded to over 5,000 acres. Margaret's school had graduated hundreds of women who'd gone on to careers and lives they'd never have had access to otherwise. And Evelyn herself had become something she'd never expected, a role model. Young women across the territory knew her story, knew about the cook who'd arrived with nothing and built an empire. They wrote her letters asking for advice, for jobs, for just acknowledgement that their dreams weren't foolish. She answered every letter personally, even when it took hours she didn't really have, because she remembered being that young woman who needed someone to believe in her, and she refused to ignore others who were in that position now. The recognition sometimes made her uncomfortable. She didn't feel like a pioneer or a success story. She felt like someone who just kept working, kept pushing, kept refusing to quit even when quitting would have been easier. But Silas reminded her that was exactly what made her special. "Most people quit," he said. "When things get hard enough, most people decide it's not worth it and they walk away. You never did. That's rare. That's worth celebrating. I was just too stubborn to know when to quit." Exactly. And thank heavens for that. As Evelyn aged, she gradually reduced her active role in the business, transitioning to more of an advisory position. Ruth took over as primary manager of Quinn and Boone Supply Company, running it with the same attention to quality that Evelyn had insisted on from the beginning. The business continued to thrive under her leadership. Evelyn spent more time at the ranch, more time with her children, more time simply living instead of constantly working. It was the adjustment, learning to slow down, learning to trust that things would continue without her constant supervision. But it was also necessary. She was in her early 50s when Silas started having health problems. Nothing immediately dangerous, but concerning enough that the doctor recommended he reduce his workload. They hired a ranch foreman to handle the day-to-day operations, and Silas transitioned into more of an oversight role. It was hard for him, stepping back from work that had defined most of his adult life. But Evelyn understood better than anyone what that felt like. She helped him through it the way he'd once helped her, reminding him that his value wasn't measured by how many hours he worked. "You built something that outlasts you," she told him. "That's the definition of success. Doesn't feel like enough sometimes." "I know, but it is." They spent more time together, taking long rides across the ranch, sitting on the porch in the evenings, traveling to visit their children when they grew up and started families of their own. Clara became a lawyer, one of the first women to practice law in Montana Territory. James took over management of the ranch, running it with the same combination of intelligence and stubbornness that had characterized both his parents. And through it all, Evelyn kept her grandmother's iron skillet hanging in the original ranch kitchen. It became something of a legend on the property, the skillet that had traveled from Ohio to Montana, that had cooked that first breakfast over a campfire, that represented everything Evelyn had built from almost nothing. On a cool autumn evening in 1895, Evelyn stood in that kitchen alone, running her fingers over the familiar surface of the skillet. She was 60 years old now, her hair more gray than brown, her body slower than it used to be. But her mind was sharp as ever, and she still remembered every detail of that first terrifying day when she'd arrived at Boone Ridge Ranch. The scared woman who'd stepped off the stagecoach felt like a completely different person now, someone from another lifetime. But Evelyn could still access that fear, that desperation, that bone-deep certainty that she was worthless and would never be anything more. She'd been so wrong. Silas came looking for her, moving slower than he used to, but still solid and steady. "There you are. Dinner's ready. I was just thinking." About how much has changed, how different everything is from those first days. Silas came to stand beside her, following her gaze to the skillet. "You ever regret it? Staying here, building all this, tying yourself to a stubborn rancher who didn't know how lucky he was?" "Not once." Evelyn leaned against him. "You? Best decision I ever made was hiring you. Second best was marrying you." "Only second best? Hiring you had to come first, or I never would have gotten the chance to marry you." Evelyn laughed, the sound lighter than it had been in her youth, but just as genuine. "Fair point." They stood there for a while, two people who'd built a life together against considerable odds, looking at a simple iron skillet that represented everything they'd overcome. "You know what I think about sometimes?" Evelyn said. "All the other women who got off stagecoaches in frontier towns, desperate and scared, hoping for a chance. How many of them got that chance? How many of them found someone willing to look past appearances and give them an opportunity? Not enough. Never enough. No, and that's what I'm proudest of. Not the business or the money or the recognition, but the fact that we created chances for others, that dozens of women got opportunities because we gave them jobs and fair pay, and the belief that they could do more than society said they could. That's your legacy, not the company or the contracts, the lives you changed." Evelyn thought about all the women who'd worked for Quinn and Boone over the years, the ones who'd arrived broken and left stronger, the ones who'd discovered skills they didn't know they had, the ones who'd gone on to start their own businesses, or support their families, or simply live with dignity and independence. That mattered. That was worth all the hard work and exhaustion and struggle. "Come on," Silas said gently. "Dinner's getting cold, and you know how you hate serving cold food." They walked together toward the dining room where their family waited. Claire was visiting with her husband and children. James and his wife were there too, along with several ranch hands who'd become part of the extended family over the years. It was loud and chaotic and full of laughter, everything Evelyn had never dared to hope for in those dark days when she'd first arrived. As she sat down at the head of the table, surrounded by the people she loved and the life she'd built, Evelyn felt a profound sense of contentment. Not because everything had been easy or perfect, it hadn't been, but because she'd fought for this, earned it, built it with her own hands and her own stubborn refusal to accept defeat. She caught Silas's eye across the table, and he raised his glass in a small salute. To survival, to partnership, to the unexpected journey that had brought them both here. Evelyn raised her glass in return, then looked around at all the faces watching her with affection and respect. "Before we eat," she said, and the room quieted, "I want to say something. I want you all to know that this, all of you, this family, this life, this is what I fought for. Not money or success or recognition. This right here. People who matter, gathered together, building something good." Clara smiled. "We know, Mama. But do you understand it? Do you understand that none of this was guaranteed? That there were 100 points where everything could have fallen apart, where I could have quit or failed or just given up?" "We understand," James said quietly. "You've told us the stories. We know what it took. Good. Because I need you to remember those stories. I need you to remember that dignity isn't something you're born with or given by others. It's something you claim for yourself by refusing to accept their limitations, by working harder than they think you can, by proving them wrong not once but over and over until they can't deny it anymore. She paused, her throat tight with emotion. I was told I was worthless, a charity case, someone to be pitied or mocked, but never respected. And I almost believed it, almost let that become my truth. But you didn't, Silas said. No, I didn't, because your great-grandmother told me something important, Clara and James. She said a good woman makes a good home wherever she goes. And I held on to that. I built my home here, in this kitchen, on this ranch, with all of you. And that's the lesson I want you to carry forward, that home isn't a place. It's what you build with your hands and your heart, no matter how impossible it seems. The room was silent for a moment. Then Clara stood and raised her glass. To Mama, who taught us that strength isn't about never falling down. It's about getting back up every single time. To Evelyn, everyone echoed, and the glasses clinked together in a toast that felt like more than just tradition. It felt like acknowledgement of everything that had been overcome to reach this moment. They ate then, the conversation flowing easily, full of laughter and stories and the comfortable chaos of family. And Evelyn sat at the center of it all, feeling the weight of years and struggles lifting slightly, replaced by something lighter and more enduring, gratitude. Not for an easy life. She'd never had that and probably never would. But for a life that mattered, a life that made a difference, a life built on her own terms, by her own hands, through her own stubborn refusal to accept what others said was possible. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Evelyn walked out to the kitchen one last time. She took down her grandmother's skillet and held it, feeling the familiar weight, the smooth surface worn by decades of use. Thank you, she whispered to the memory of her grandmother, to the scared woman she'd once been, to every person who'd believed in her when she couldn't believe in herself. Thank you for teaching me that I was worth more than they said, that I could build something from nothing, that refusal to quit was its own kind of strength. She hung the skillet back on its hook, a reminder of where everything had started, where everything had almost ended before it began. But it hadn't ended. It had grown into something bigger and more meaningful than she'd ever imagined possible. And that, Evelyn understood, was the real story. Not the success or the money or the recognition, but the simple, profound truth that she'd been told she was worthless and had refused to believe it, had fought against that lie with everything she had until it became undeniable that she was worth something after all. She was worth the fight. She was worth the struggle. She was worth every moment of pain and fear and exhaustion that had brought her here. And so was every other person who'd ever been dismissed or overlooked or told they'd never amount to anything. They were worth the fight too. Worth the chance. Worth someone believing in them the way Silas had believed in Evelyn all those years ago. That was the legacy she wanted to leave. Not buildings or businesses or money, but the idea that worthiness isn't determined by circumstances or appearance or society's judgment. It's proven through action, through perseverance, through the daily, unglamorous work of building a life that matters. Evelyn Boone, who'd once been Evelyn Mercer, the desperate woman with the worn-out boots and the iron skillet, had proven that beyond any doubt, and she hoped that somewhere, someday, another scared woman would hear her story and find the courage to prove it too.